There may have been a moment when being human was not a shared condition across continents, but a fragile state carried by only a small number of living bodies. Not because humanity had not spread, but because it had been reduced, slowly and without intention, by forces that did not recognize its importance. The early human story may not be one of steady growth, but of repeated narrowing, where most possible futures disappeared before they could continue. What we call survival may simply be what remained after almost everything else was lost. If so much of human existence passed through such thin and uncertain moments, why were so few humans left alive? What it means for humans to be many is a relatively recent condition, and when we look back toward the beginning of our species, the idea becomes less stable, almost uncertain in its meaning. Early human populations were not gathered into large visible groups, but spread thinly across landscapes that were vast, uneven, and often indifferent to their presence. Even when humans had already moved beyond their earliest origins in Africa, their numbers did not suddenly expand in a continuous way. Instead, they remained scattered, divided into small bands that rarely encountered one another, each group carrying only a small portion of what it meant to be human at that time. If one of these groups disappeared, it did not echo across the world. It simply ended, quietly, without leaving a trace that could easily be seen or remembered. From the perspective of today, where billions exist simultaneously, it becomes difficult to imagine how fragile that earlier condition was, how easily the presence of humans could narrow without notice. This thin distribution meant that the total number of humans was not just small, but structurally vulnerable. A population that is spread out into many isolated groups does not behave like a single, unified whole. It behaves more like many separate beginnings, each one dependent on its own local conditions, each one capable of ending without affecting the others directly. In such a structure, many does not provide safety. It does not accumulate into resilience. Instead, it remains divided, and division creates silence between groups, a silence where no help can arrive and no recovery can be shared. If we follow this pattern back toward the earliest phases of human existence, the condition becomes even more delicate. The first humans did not emerge into a stable world prepared to support them. They appeared within ecosystems that had already been shaped by other species, other forms of life that were often better adapted to specific environments. Humans did not dominate these spaces. They occupied them carefully, often at the edges, relying on flexibility rather than strength. This meant that even small disruptions could have larger effects. A shift in available food, a change in seasonal patterns, or the loss of a few individuals could alter the balance within a group in ways that were not easily reversed. Over time, this creates a pattern where growth is not continuous, but interrupted, paused, and sometimes reversed. The idea that human numbers steadily increased over time does not align well with what is understood about early population dynamics. Instead, the more consistent pattern is one of fluctuation, where periods of expansion are followed by periods of contraction, and where the overall number of humans can remain low for very long stretches of time. This becomes clearer when we consider how dependent early humans were on their immediate surroundings. Without the ability to store large amounts of food, without stable shelter in many regions, and without the kinds of social structures that allow large populations to be sustained, each group lived close to the limits of what their environment could provide. In such conditions, there is little buffer against change. A difficult season is not just uncomfortable, it can reduce the number of people who survive into the next year. And if this happens repeatedly, the group itself becomes smaller, more fragile, and less able to recover. When we return to the central question, the idea that so few humans were left alive begins to feel less like a sudden event and more like a recurring state. Not a single moment of near disappearance, but many moments where the number of humans remained low, held in place by the combined effects of environment, biology, and structure. In this way, the early human story may not be one of rising numbers, but of narrow continuities, where being human meant existing within limits that were always close, always present, and rarely overcome for long. When small human groups are separated by distance, the meaning of survival changes in a quiet but important way. Survival is no longer something that can be shared across a wide network. It becomes local, immediate, and limited to the people who are physically present. In such a condition, the existence of other humans somewhere beyond the horizon does not increase the chances of a group continuing. It simply means that elsewhere, in another place, a different group is facing its own version of the same uncertainty. This separation creates a pattern where human presence is not continuous across space, but broken into isolated points, each one surrounded by areas where no humans live at all. When we imagine early human landscapes, it is more accurate to think of them as mostly empty, with only small clusters of people occupying certain areas for limited periods of time. This emptiness is not just geographical, it reflects the limits of how far humans could move, how much they could carry, and how well they could adapt to unfamiliar conditions. Moving from one place to another was not a simple extension of territory. It was a transition into uncertainty, where known sources of food, water, and shelter were left behind. Because of this, groups tended to remain within ranges that they understood, and this further reinforced their isolation. Over long periods, such patterns create distances not only in space but also in experience. Different groups may face different conditions, develop different ways of living, and adapt to their surroundings in ways that are not easily transferable. This means that even if two groups eventually come into contact, they are not necessarily able to support each other in a direct or immediate way. The idea of a shared human condition, where knowledge and resources can flow freely between groups, does not fully apply in these early stages. Instead, each group exists within its own limits, shaped by its environment and its own internal structure. If one group encounters a period of difficulty, there is no guarantee that help will arrive from elsewhere. The distance is often too great, the connection too weak, and the timing too uncertain. From an archaeological perspective, this kind of isolation can be seen in the uneven distribution of human remains and artifacts. Some regions show clear evidence of human presence for a time, followed by long periods where no traces are found. These gaps do not necessarily mean that humans completely disappeared from the entire world. They suggest that in certain places, human groups ended, and no new groups arrived to replace them for extended periods. This pattern reinforces the idea that early human populations were not only small, but also discontinuous across both space and time. The absence of continuous presence makes the idea of many humans less meaningful, because there was no stable or connected population that could maintain its size over long durations. Instead, there were many beginnings and many endings, each one limited to a particular place and time. If we return again to the earliest origins of our species, this fragmentation becomes even more significant. The first humans did not spread out from a central point in a smooth, expanding wave. Their movement was irregular, shaped by changing environments, available resources, and the constraints of their own bodies. Some movements led to new areas where groups could survive for a time. Others may have led to places where survival was not sustainable, resulting in the quiet disappearance of those who had moved there. Over generations, this creates a landscape where human presence appears and disappears in different regions, without forming a continuous pattern. In this sense, the number of humans alive at any given moment is not simply a matter of counting individuals. It is also a question of how those individuals are distributed, how connected they are, and how resilient their local conditions happen to be. When distribution is thin, connection is weak, and resilience is low, the total number of humans can remain small even across a wide area. The idea that so few humans were left alive is therefore not only about how many people existed, but about how separated they were from one another, and how little their existence could reinforce itself across the broader landscape of early human history. If we continue to follow this pattern of separation and small group size, another layer begins to appear, one that is less visible but just as important. It concerns how time itself interacts with population. A group that is small and isolated is not only vulnerable in a single moment, but also across successive generations. Survival must be repeated again and again, and each repetition carries its own risk. It is not enough for a group to endure one difficult season. It must endure many, and the effects of each season do not disappear completely before the next begins. In such conditions, continuity becomes a fragile process, dependent on the consistent survival of enough individuals to sustain the group over time. When the number of people is low, the margin for error is narrow. The loss of a few individuals can change the structure of the group in ways that are not immediately visible, but gradually become significant. This may affect how tasks are shared, how knowledge is passed on, and how the group responds to new challenges. Over time, these small changes can accumulate, making the group less stable even without a single dramatic event. This kind of slow pressure is difficult to detect in any single moment, but it shapes the long-term pattern of human presence. Archaeological evidence reflects this in subtle ways. In some regions, the record shows intermittent occupation, where human activity appears for a period, then fades, and then returns again much later. These patterns suggest that groups were not continuously present in the same places. Instead, their presence depended on conditions that could support them for a time, but not indefinitely. When those conditions changed, the group might move, adapt, or, in some cases, fail to continue. Because the groups were small, their disappearance would not necessarily leave a clear or dramatic trace. It would simply create a gap, a quiet absence that becomes visible only when viewed across long spans of time. This intermittent presence reinforces the idea that early human populations did not build steadily toward larger and more stable numbers. Instead, they existed within cycles of appearance and disappearance, shaped by factors that were often beyond their control. When we consider the earliest stages of human development, this pattern becomes even more significant. The origin of our species did not occur in isolation from these pressures. Early humans were already subject to the same constraints of small group size, limited resources, and environmental variability. The conditions that allowed humans to emerge were also conditions that could limit their expansion. This creates a situation where the existence of humans is not guaranteed to increase over time, but must continually re-establish itself within the boundaries set by environment and biology. From this perspective, the question of why so few humans were left alive begins to shift. It is not only about specific events that reduced population, but about the underlying structure that kept populations small in the first place. The combination of isolation, small group size, and the need for repeated survival across generations creates a system where human numbers remain low for extended periods. Even when groups succeed in maintaining themselves for several generations, this success does not necessarily extend beyond their immediate context. It remains local, limited, and dependent on conditions that may not persist. In this way, early human history can be understood as a series of narrow continuities, where the presence of humans is sustained not by large numbers or strong connections, but by the repeated ability of small groups to endure within their specific environments. Each group carries forward a part of the human story, but none of them alone represents its entirety. The overall number of humans is therefore the sum of many fragile continuities, each one capable of ending quietly, without altering the broader pattern. This helps explain why, across long stretches of time, the number of humans could remain low, not because growth was impossible, but because continuity itself was always under pressure, always uncertain, and always limited by the conditions in which early humans first came into existence. The environments in which early humans lived were not stable backgrounds that quietly supported life. They were active systems, constantly changing in ways that could alter the conditions for survival without warning or intention. Climate patterns shifted over long periods, but also within shorter cycles that could transform landscapes from one state to another. Rainfall could become less predictable, temperatures could move beyond familiar ranges, and the distribution of plants and animals could change in response. For small human groups, these changes were not distant or abstract. They were immediate, shaping what could be found, what could be used, and what could be relied upon from one season to the next. The idea that the world would remain consistent enough to allow steady growth did not align with the conditions that early humans experienced. Instead, the environment often introduced uncertainty at a scale that matched the limits of human adaptation at that time. When a group depended closely on its surroundings, even a subtle shift could have layered effects. A change in plant availability might reduce the presence of animals that fed on those plants, which in turn could reduce hunting opportunities. Water sources might become less accessible or move to different locations, requiring adjustments in movement that carried their own risks. Because early humans did not have the means to store large surpluses or to control their environment in lasting ways, they were continually responding rather than shaping. This reactive condition meant that stability was temporary, and that each period of relative balance could be followed by disruption. Over time, this creates a pattern where the environment does not simply support human life, but also limits how far and how consistently that life can extend. From the perspective of human origins, this dynamic becomes even more important. The early stages of our species unfolded during periods of significant climatic variation, where cycles of cooler and warmer conditions influenced the structure of ecosystems. These changes did not affect all regions in the same way, and this unevenness contributed to the fragmentation of human populations. Some areas may have become more supportive for a time, allowing groups to persist or expand slightly, while others became less stable, leading to contraction or movement. This uneven pattern reinforces the idea that human presence was not continuous across large areas, but concentrated in pockets where conditions were temporarily favorable. Even within those pockets, the balance was not guaranteed to last. When conditions shifted again, the same areas could become difficult to inhabit, forcing groups to adjust or relocate. Each adjustment required energy, knowledge, and timing, and not all groups would have been equally able to respond. The environment did not select for survival in a direct or intentional way. It simply changed, and those changes created conditions where some groups could continue, while others could not. This process did not produce a steady increase in human numbers. Instead, it maintained a level of uncertainty that kept populations from expanding beyond certain limits for extended periods. Archaeological records provide indirect support for this pattern through evidence of changing habitation sites. Some locations show repeated use over time, suggesting that they offered relatively stable conditions during certain periods. Others appear only briefly in the record, indicating that they were occupied when conditions allowed and then abandoned when they no longer did. These patterns suggest that early humans were moving within a shifting landscape, following opportunities that were temporary rather than permanent. The world did not present itself as a consistent space for human life to spread and accumulate. It presented itself as a series of changing conditions, where survival depended on the ability to adjust without any guarantee that adjustment would be enough. When this environmental instability is considered alongside the small and isolated structure of human populations, the question of why so few humans were left alive begins to take on a different form. It is not only about the number of people, but about the conditions that prevented that number from growing steadily. The environment, in its variability and unpredictability, acted as a constant pressure that limited expansion and introduced repeated challenges to continuity. In this way, the early human story is shaped not just by what humans were able to do, but by what the world allowed them to maintain, often only for a time, and rarely without interruption. Even when environmental change is not abrupt, its effects can accumulate in ways that slowly reshape the conditions of survival. A landscape does not need to transform dramatically in a single moment to become less supportive. Gradual shifts in temperature, moisture, and vegetation can alter the balance of an ecosystem over time, and these alterations can pass beneath immediate notice, while still influencing what is available to those who depend on it. For early humans, whose lives were closely tied to the patterns of their surroundings, such gradual changes could create a sense of continuity on the surface, while quietly reducing the stability beneath it. What appears familiar may no longer function in the same way, and this difference can emerge only after several cycles have already passed. In such a context, the environment does not present a clear signal that change has occurred. Instead, it introduces small variations that accumulate into larger effects, often recognized only when adaptation becomes more difficult. This form of change places a particular kind of pressure on small, isolated groups. Because their knowledge is built from repeated experience within a certain range of conditions, it may not fully account for gradual shifts that alter those conditions beyond their usual limits. A hunting ground that once supported consistent returns may begin to yield less, not because of a sudden loss, but because the underlying system has changed. Water sources may still exist, but become less reliable or more distant over time. These adjustments require responses, but the responses themselves depend on the capacity of the group to recognize patterns and modify behavior accordingly. When the group is small, the range of possible responses is limited, and the margin for unsuccessful adjustment is narrow. Over multiple generations, these pressures do not necessarily result in immediate disappearance. Instead, they may lead to a slow reduction in group size, where fewer individuals survive or reproduce successfully. This reduction can continue quietly, without a single defining moment, until the group becomes too small to sustain itself effectively. From the perspective of the archaeological record, such processes are difficult to trace with precision, but their effects can be inferred from patterns of presence and absence across different regions. Sites that show repeated occupation may eventually show a decline in intensity or a complete gap, suggesting that the conditions that once supported human activity were no longer sufficient. These patterns do not always align with evidence of sudden environmental events. Instead, they often correspond to broader climatic trends that unfolded over long periods. This reinforces the idea that human populations were influenced not only by dramatic changes, but also by subtle shifts that gradually altered the landscape of survival. If we look back toward the earlier phases of human existence, these gradual pressures would have been present from the beginning. The environments in which humans first developed were not fixed or stable, but part of a dynamic system influenced by larger climatic cycles. The emergence of our species occurred within these changing conditions, meaning that early humans were already adapted to variability, but not necessarily to all possible directions of change. Adaptation can support survival within a certain range, but when conditions move beyond that range, the same adaptations may become less effective. This creates a situation where survival is always contingent, always dependent on the alignment between the group and its environment at a given time. When that alignment weakens, even slightly, the effects can build across generations. In this way, the question of why so few humans were left alive can be approached through the lens of accumulated change rather than singular events. The environment does not need to remove large numbers of people at once. It can reduce the capacity for survival gradually, shaping outcomes over extended periods. For small, isolated groups, these gradual reductions are difficult to reverse because recovery requires not only stability, but also the presence of enough individuals to rebuild and sustain continuity. Without that, the group may persist for a time, but with diminishing resilience, until its presence becomes intermittent or ends altogether. This pattern does not produce clear boundaries or dramatic turning points. It produces a quiet narrowing, where the number of humans remains low, held in place by conditions that are always shifting, always influencing, and rarely fully stable across the long span of early human history. When environmental change reaches beyond a certain threshold, it can alter not only what is available, but where life itself can be sustained. Landscapes that once supported repeated human presence may become less predictable, and in some cases, no longer viable for extended occupation. This does not always occur through a single, visible transformation. It may unfold through a combination of factors that together shift the balance of an entire region. Temperature ranges may move outside familiar patterns, vegetation zones may shift their boundaries, and animal populations may follow routes that no longer pass through previously used areas. For small human groups, these shifts redefine the limits of where they can remain and where they must move. The environment, in this sense, does not simply change within a fixed space. It changes the space itself, altering the map of possibility that early humans depended upon. As these boundaries shift, the distances between viable areas can increase. Regions that once connected different groups may become more difficult to cross, or may no longer support travel in the same way. This has the effect of deepening the isolation already present in early human populations. Groups that were once separated by manageable distances may become effectively isolated, with fewer opportunities for contact or exchange. This isolation is not only spatial, but also temporal. The timing of movements, the availability of resources, and the conditions required for travel may no longer align in ways that allow groups to encounter one another. Over time, this can lead to a further fragmentation of human presence, where each group exists within a more confined and less connected space. From the perspective of human origins, this process interacts with the limits of adaptation. Early humans were capable of adjusting to a range of environments, but this capacity was not unlimited. Adaptation requires time, and when environmental conditions shift more quickly than a group can adjust, the gap between need and ability becomes difficult to close. Movement becomes one response, but movement itself carries uncertainty. Entering a new environment means encountering unfamiliar patterns of availability, new risks, and conditions that may not align with existing knowledge. Some groups may succeed in establishing themselves in new areas, but others may not. The outcome is not uniform, and over many such movements, the overall pattern can remain one of limited expansion rather than continuous growth. Archaeological evidence offers indirect insight into these shifting boundaries through the changing distribution of sites across different periods. Certain regions show phases of increased human activity followed by reduction or absence, suggesting that the conditions supporting habitation moved over time. These patterns do not indicate a coordinated movement of all humans, but rather a series of local adjustments, where different groups respond to changing conditions in different ways. Some follow shifting resources, others remain and adapt as long as possible, and some disappear from the record without clear evidence of where they went. This variability reinforces the idea that early human populations were not moving together as a unified whole, but as separate groups, each navigating its own relationship with a changing environment. When we consider how this affects the overall number of humans, the implications become more visible. A world where habitable zones are shifting, distances between them are increasing, and connections between groups are weakening does not support steady population growth. It supports a pattern where numbers remain constrained, because the space in which humans can live is itself unstable and unevenly distributed. Even when some regions become more favorable, others may become less so, balancing any local increases with declines elsewhere. The total number of humans is therefore shaped not only by how many individuals can be supported in a given place, but also by how those places are arranged, how they change over time, and how accessible they are to one another. In this way, the question of why so few humans were left alive is closely tied to the shifting geography of survival. The world did not offer a consistent or expanding space for human life. It offered a moving landscape where opportunities appeared and disappeared, where connections formed and broke, and where the presence of humans was always dependent on conditions that could change without notice. Within such a system, remaining few is not an exception. It is a condition that follows naturally from the limits imposed by a world that was never stable enough to support continuous and widespread human presence over long periods of time. If we shift our view from individual places to longer spans of time, the pattern of environmental change begins to take on a different meaning. It is no longer a matter of isolated shifts affecting specific groups, but a continuous sequence of changes that reshape the conditions of human life again and again. These changes do not follow a simple direction toward improvement or decline. Instead, they move through cycles, where periods of relative stability are followed by phases of transformation, and then by new forms of balance that are themselves temporary. For early humans, living within these cycles meant that no single way of life could remain sufficient across extended periods. What worked in one phase might become less effective in the next, and the adjustments required were not always small or gradual. The timing of these cycles is important. Climatic shifts often unfold over spans that exceed a single human lifetime, which means that individuals experience only a portion of the change. A person may grow up in conditions that appear consistent, only to find that those conditions begin to alter later in life. However, the full effect of such changes becomes clearer across generations. What one generation adapts to may no longer be suitable for the next, creating a sequence where each generation must respond to slightly different circumstances. This creates a form of discontinuity that is not immediately visible but becomes significant over time. The knowledge and practices that support survival are always tied to specific conditions, and when those conditions shift, the same knowledge may no longer be enough. In small and isolated groups, this process has particular consequences. The transmission of knowledge depends on continuity, but when the environment changes across generations, continuity becomes more difficult to maintain. A strategy that was effective in the past may persist for a time, even as its effectiveness declines. Adjusting to new conditions requires not only recognizing change, but also developing new approaches, and this takes time. During that period, the group may experience reduced success in obtaining resources, maintaining health, or sustaining its numbers. These effects do not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. A slight reduction in success, repeated over several generations, can lead to a gradual decrease in population. From the perspective of human origins, these long-term cycles intersect with the early development of our species in ways that limit expansion. Early humans did not emerge into a period of stable and predictable conditions that would allow steady growth. They emerged within an already shifting system, where climatic cycles influence the distribution of resources and the structure of ecosystems. This means that from the beginning, Human populations were subject to a moving baseline where the conditions for survival were never fixed. Adaptation allowed humans to respond within certain limits, but those limits were defined by the range of variability they could accommodate. When conditions moved beyond that range, the effectiveness of adaptation decreased, and the need for further adjustment became more urgent. Archaeological and environmental evidence, when considered together, suggests that these cycles influenced where and when humans could persist. Regions that supported human presence during one period may show reduced activity or absence during another, not because humans disappeared everywhere, but because the conditions that allowed them to live in those specific places changed. This creates a pattern of shifting presence across time, where the locations of human activity move in response to broader environmental cycles. The result is not a continuous expansion of human numbers, but a redistribution of a relatively small population across different regions as conditions change. When we return to the central question, the idea that so few humans were left alive can be understood as a reflection of these long-term dynamics. The cycles of environmental change did not simply create challenges that humans could overcome once and then leave behind. They created an ongoing process where each generation faced a slightly different version of the same problem: how to align with conditions that were always in motion. In such a system, growth is not cumulative in a simple way. It is repeatedly interrupted, adjusted, and sometimes reversed. The number of humans at any given time reflects not only past successes, but also the current phase of these cycles and the degree to which human populations are able to align with the conditions they encounter. This alignment is never complete or permanent, and because of that, the total number of humans remains limited, shaped by a history that is defined less by steady increase and more by repeated adaptation within a world that does not remain still. When these long cycles of environmental change are viewed across multiple generations, another pattern becomes visible, one that does not depend on sudden disruption, but on the quiet accumulation of mismatch between human behavior and shifting conditions. Each generation inherits ways of living that were shaped by earlier environments, and those inherited patterns carry an expectation that the world will continue to behave in similar ways. When the environment begins to move beyond that expectation, the difference is not always immediately clear. It emerges gradually, through small inconsistencies between what is anticipated and what is encountered. A path that once led to reliable resources may no longer do so with the same consistency. Seasonal patterns that once guided movement may begin to shift in timing or intensity. These changes do not erase existing knowledge, but they reduce its effectiveness in subtle ways. For small groups, this creates a situation where adaptation is always slightly behind the pace of change. Adjustments are made, but they are often based on incomplete information, shaped by experiences that reflect only part of the ongoing transformation. Because the group is limited in size, the range of perspectives and experiences it can draw upon is also limited. This means that recognition of change may come slowly, and responses may not fully align with the new conditions. Over time, this gap between behavior and environment can influence survival in ways that are not immediately visible. The group may continue to exist, but with reduced efficiency in finding resources, increased exposure to risk, or greater strain on its internal structure. These effects, repeated across generations, can lead to a gradual narrowing of population without a single defining moment. From the standpoint of early human origins, this pattern is significant because it suggests that even successful adaptations were temporary in their effectiveness. The early human body and its associated behaviors were shaped within certain environmental ranges, and while they allowed flexibility, they did not eliminate dependence on those ranges. As conditions shifted beyond familiar limits, the same adaptations could become less suitable, requiring further change. This process does not occur instantly. It unfolds over time, during which the group must continue to survive using strategies that may no longer be optimal. In this transitional period, the balance between survival and loss becomes more delicate. The group may persist, but with increasing vulnerability as each generation attempts to adjust to conditions that are still in motion. Archaeological patterns provide indirect evidence of this process through variations in site usage and material culture over time. Changes in tool types, habitation patterns, and resource use suggest that human groups were continually adjusting to new conditions. However, these adjustments do not always appear as clear improvements or progress. In some cases, they may reflect a reduction in options, where groups rely on fewer or less reliable resources. This can be seen as a form of constraint rather than expansion, where the range of viable strategies becomes narrower as conditions change. Such patterns support the idea that human populations were not steadily growing, but navigating a shifting set of possibilities, where each adjustment carried both potential benefits and new limitations. When this process is considered across broader spans of time, it helps explain why the number of humans could remain low even without large-scale events that reduce populations suddenly. The continuous need to adjust, combined with the limits of knowledge and adaptation within small groups, creates a system where growth is repeatedly moderated by the environment. The population does not simply increase when conditions improve, because improvement itself is often temporary and unevenly distributed. Instead, there are periods where groups manage to align more closely with their surroundings, followed by periods where that alignment weakens again. The overall effect is a pattern of fluctuation within a constrained range rather than a steady upward trend. In this way, the question of why so few humans were left alive can be understood as a result of ongoing misalignment between human systems and environmental cycles. The mismatch is not constant or complete, but it is persistent enough to limit long-term expansion. Each generation inherits both the advantages and the limitations of previous adaptations, and must navigate a world that is always slightly different from the one those adaptations were designed for. Within this moving context, survival is not a fixed achievement, but a process that must be continually renewed, and because that process is never fully stable, the number of humans remains limited, shaped by cycles that do not pause long enough to allow continuous growth. Over longer spans of time, these cycles of change do not simply repeat in the same form. They overlap, shift in intensity, and interact with one another in ways that create layers of uncertainty rather than a single pattern that can be anticipated. A period of relative stability in temperature may coincide with changes in rainfall, or a shift in vegetation may occur alongside changes in animal movement. For early human groups, this layering of change means that adaptation is not directed toward one clear challenge, but toward a combination of influences that do not always align. A response that helps in one aspect of survival may introduce new difficulties in another, and the balance between these effects is not always predictable. This complexity adds another dimension to the limits already present in small, isolated populations. It is not only that conditions change, but that they change in ways that are difficult to interpret as a whole. Each generation inherits partial knowledge shaped by earlier conditions, and applies that knowledge within a context that may no longer match it fully. The result is not a complete failure of adaptation, but a gradual narrowing of its effectiveness across multiple areas at once. When such layered changes persist over time, they influence not only immediate survival, but also the structure of movement and settlement. Groups may begin to adjust their ranges, shifting toward areas that appear more stable or more predictable, but these areas are themselves part of the same dynamic system. What seems stable for a time may later become less so, requiring further adjustment. This creates a pattern where human presence moves across the landscape, not in a directed expansion, but in response to shifting conditions that do not settle into a permanent state. From the perspective of human origins, this movement occurs within a world where the boundaries of habitability are not fixed. Early humans were not simply spreading into empty space, but navigating a landscape where the conditions for survival expanded and contracted over time. Some regions may have supported human groups for extended periods, becoming centers of continuity, while others may have only been suitable for shorter intervals. This uneven distribution of habitable space reinforces the fragmentation of human populations, as groups cluster in certain areas while leaving others unoccupied. The connections between these clusters remain limited, and the overall number of humans is shaped by the combined capacity of these scattered regions, rather than by any single continuous expansion. Archaeological records, when viewed across broad timescales, reflect this pattern through the shifting distribution of sites and the varying intensity of human activity. Certain periods show wider dispersal, suggesting that conditions allowed for a broader range of habitation, while other periods show contraction, with activity concentrated in fewer areas. These changes do not correspond to a simple narrative of progress. Instead, they suggest that human populations expanded and contracted in response to environmental conditions that were themselves changing in complex ways. The absence of continuous growth across these records supports the idea that the number of humans remained constrained by factors that operated over long durations, not just by isolated events. When these layered and shifting cycles are considered together, the question of why so few humans were left alive becomes less about a specific cause and more about an ongoing condition. The environment did not provide a stable framework within which human populations could steadily increase. It presented a series of overlapping changes that required constant adjustment without offering a permanent solution. In such a system, survival is not cumulative in a straightforward way. Gains made during one period may be reduced in another, and the overall trajectory remains bounded by the limits of adaptation. Early human populations, already small and isolated, were especially sensitive to these dynamics, as they had limited capacity to absorb repeated adjustments across multiple aspects of their environment. This helps explain why, over long stretches of time, the number of humans could remain low, not because growth was impossible, but because it was continually moderated by conditions that did not stabilize long enough to support sustained expansion. The result is a history where human presence persists, but within narrow limits shaped by a world that was always in motion and rarely aligned fully with the needs of those who lived within it. When human groups remain small across long periods of time, their continuity depends on a structure that is inherently fragile. A small group is not simply a reduced version of a large population. It operates under different constraints, where each individual carries a proportionally greater role in maintaining the group's stability. The loss or absence of even a few individuals can shift how tasks are performed, how knowledge is preserved, and how future generations are supported. This creates a condition where survival is not only about enduring external pressures, but also about maintaining an internal balance that is easily disrupted. In such groups, the number of individuals of different ages matters in ways that are not immediately visible. There must be enough adults to sustain daily needs, enough younger individuals to continue the group into the future, and enough overlap between generations to allow knowledge to be passed on effectively. When the total number of people is low, achieving this balance becomes more difficult. A small change in the number of births, or in the survival of younger individuals, can alter the structure of the group in ways that are not easily corrected. These shifts may not lead to immediate disappearance, but they can reduce the group's ability to maintain itself across time. Over several generations, this can result in a gradual weakening of continuity, where each new generation begins with fewer resources, less accumulated knowledge, or reduced capacity to respond to challenges. From the perspective of early human origins, this fragility is part of the initial condition rather than a later development. The first humans did not emerge as part of large, stable populations. They existed within small groups that were already subject to these structural limits. This means that the early continuation of our species depended not on a broad and secure base, but on the repeated success of many small groups maintaining their internal balance over time. Each group carried only a portion of the total human population, and each group faced its own set of conditions. The overall number of humans was therefore the sum of many local continuities, each one limited and each one vulnerable to disruption. This structure also influences how groups respond to environmental change. A larger population may absorb losses or adjust more flexibly, but a small group has fewer options. If conditions shift in a way that reduces available resources, the group may not have the capacity to redistribute roles or to buffer the impact across a wide network. Instead, the effects are concentrated, and the consequences become more immediate. This can lead to a situation where the group persists, but with reduced resilience, making it more susceptible to further challenges. The cumulative effect of these pressures across generations can narrow the path of continuity, even in the absence of a single decisive event. Archaeological patterns provide indirect insight into this fragility through the intermittent nature of human presence in many regions. The appearance of a site may reflect a period when a group maintained its structure successfully, while its disappearance may reflect a breakdown in that structure rather than a dramatic external cause. Because the groups are small, such breakdowns do not leave large or easily identifiable traces. They appear as gaps, as periods where human activity is no longer visible in the record. These gaps reinforce the idea that continuity was not guaranteed, but had to be sustained under conditions that were often close to the limits of what small groups could manage. When we consider the question of why so few humans were left alive, this internal fragility becomes an essential part of the answer. It is not only the environment that limits human numbers, but also the structure of human populations themselves. Small groups do not easily accumulate into larger, more stable populations when the conditions required for growth are rarely met for long. Instead, they remain within a narrow range, where continuity depends on maintaining a delicate balance across generations. This balance is not fixed or secure. It is something that must be recreated repeatedly under changing conditions with limited resources and limited margins for error. In this way, the small size of early human groups is not just a feature of their existence. It is a condition that shapes the entire pattern of human presence, keeping numbers low and continuity uncertain across the long span of early human history. Within small human groups, the continuity of generations depends not only on numbers, but on the timing and overlap between those numbers. It is not enough for individuals to survive independently. Their lives must align in ways that allow the group to function as a continuous chain rather than as disconnected segments. This alignment involves the presence of individuals at different stages of life at the same time, creating a structure where knowledge, skills, and responsibilities can move gradually from one generation to the next. When the group is small, this overlap becomes more difficult to maintain, and even slight variations in timing can have lasting effects. If too few younger individuals reach maturity at the same time, the capacity of the group to sustain its activities may weaken. If older individuals are lost before knowledge has been fully transferred, certain practices may not continue in the same form. These changes are not always visible in a single moment, but they influence how the group carries itself forward across time. The continuity of generations is therefore not a simple sequence, but a coordinated process that depends on the balance between different age groups. In early human populations, where groups were often small and isolated, maintaining this balance would have been a constant challenge. Environmental pressures, variations in resource availability, and the inherent uncertainties of survival all influence how many individuals reach different stages of life. These influences do not act in isolation. They combine in ways that can shift the structure of a group over time. A period of reduced resource availability may affect the survival of younger individuals, altering the composition of the group in the following generation. This change may then influence how knowledge is transmitted, how tasks are distributed, and how effectively the group can respond to future challenges. The effects are cumulative, extending beyond the immediate moment into the structure of the group across multiple generations. From the perspective of human origins, this dynamic was present from the beginning. Early human groups did not have large populations that could buffer these fluctuations. Each group depended on its own internal structure to maintain continuity, and that structure was always subject to variation. The emergence of our species did not occur in a context where generational stability was guaranteed. Instead, it occurred within small groups where the alignment of generations had to be maintained repeatedly under changing conditions. This means that the continuation of human populations relied on a process that was inherently variable, shaped by factors that could not be fully controlled or predicted. Archaeological evidence, while indirect, suggests that such variability influenced patterns of human presence. Differences in site occupation over time may reflect not only changes in environment, but also changes in the internal structure of groups. A group that is able to maintain a stable overlap of generations may leave more consistent traces, while a group experiencing disruption in this overlap may show a shorter or more intermittent presence. These patterns do not always correspond to large-scale environmental events, indicating that internal dynamics played a role alongside external conditions. The absence of continuous occupation in certain areas may therefore reflect moments when generational continuity was not sustained, rather than a single external cause. When we consider the broader question of why so few humans were left alive, this aspect of timing and overlap becomes significant. The number of humans is not only limited by how many individuals exist at a given moment, but by how effectively those individuals form a continuous sequence across time. If that sequence is interrupted, even in small ways, the effects can accumulate, reducing the capacity for growth and making recovery more difficult. In small populations, there is little margin for such interruptions, and their impact is more pronounced. Over long periods, this contributes to a pattern where human numbers remain low, not because individuals cannot survive, but because the structure required for sustained continuity is difficult to maintain consistently. The early human story, when viewed through this lens, becomes a series of fragile alignments, where the continuation of generations depends on conditions that must come together in specific ways, and where even slight disruptions can shape the overall trajectory of human presence across time. In very small populations, continuity is shaped not only by how many individuals are present, but by how those individuals are connected through reproduction across generations. When the number of potential partners is limited, the structure of relationships becomes more constrained, and this constraint can influence the long-term stability of the group in subtle ways. It does not require a sudden or visible disruption. Instead, it emerges gradually, as each generation draws from a narrower pool of possible combinations. This narrowing can affect how traits are carried forward, not in a directed or intentional manner, but as a consequence of limited variation within the group. Over time, this can reduce the flexibility of the population in responding to changing conditions, because the range of traits available for adaptation becomes more restricted. This process does not need to be understood consciously by the individuals within the group. It operates quietly, across generations, as a structural feature of small populations. The effects are not immediate, and they do not always lead to clear outcomes in a single generation. However, when combined with environmental pressures and the challenges of maintaining generational overlap, this narrowing of variation can contribute to a gradual reduction in resilience. A group may continue to exist, but with less capacity to adjust when conditions change beyond familiar ranges. From the perspective of early human origins, this constraint would have been present alongside other limitations. Early human groups were not only small and isolated, but also dependent on maintaining enough variation within their populations to support long-term continuity. The emergence and persistence of our species did not occur within large, interconnected populations that could easily exchange individuals and maintain diversity. Instead, it unfolded within a network of small groups, each carrying only a portion of the total variation present across all humans at the time. Movement between groups could introduce new variation, but such movement was not always frequent or reliable. Distances, environmental barriers, and the risks associated with travel all limited the extent to which different groups could interact. This means that each group often relied primarily on its own internal structure to sustain variation across generations. Archaeological and genetic studies, when interpreted carefully, suggest that early human populations experienced periods of reduced diversity, consistent with phases where population size was limited. These patterns do not point to a single cause, but to a combination of factors that constrained population size and connectivity. The evidence indicates that human populations were not always large enough or interconnected enough to maintain high levels of variation consistently. Instead, they moved through phases where diversity was reduced and then, in some cases, partially restored through later expansion or contact. This fluctuation aligns with the broader pattern of small, isolated groups navigating changing environments over long periods. When we consider how this influences the number of humans, it adds another layer to the question of why so few were left alive. It is not only that populations were small and environments unstable, but also that the internal structure of these populations limited their ability to expand and adapt over time. A reduction in variation does not immediately reduce the number of individuals, but it can influence how well those individuals cope with new challenges. When conditions change, groups with less variation may have fewer pathways to adjustment, making them more vulnerable to further decline. Over multiple generations, this can contribute to a pattern where populations remain constrained, not because survival is impossible, but because the capacity for sustained adaptation is limited. This process is gradual and often invisible in the short term, but it shapes the long-term trajectory of human presence. The early human story, when viewed through this lens, is not only about surviving external pressures, but also about maintaining the internal conditions that allow survival to continue. Small population size, limited connectivity, and constrained variation together create a system where growth is difficult to sustain, and where continuity depends on a delicate balance that is not always maintained. In this way, the number of humans remains low, shaped by both the external world and the internal structure of the populations themselves. each influencing the other across the long span of early human history. The human body carries within it a set of limits that were shaped over a long evolutionary history, and these limits do not always align with the full range of conditions found in the environments early humans encountered. While the body is adaptable in many ways, this adaptability operates within boundaries that are not always visible until they are tested. Temperature, nutrition, hydration, and exposure to pathogens all interact with the body in ways that can support survival up to a point. But beyond that point, the same systems begin to show strain. In small, isolated groups, where each individual contributes significantly to the continuity of the population, the effects of these limits become more pronounced. The body does not function independently of its surroundings, and when those surroundings shift, the balance that supports physical stability can be altered in subtle but meaningful ways. Early humans did not possess technologies that could consistently buffer these changes. Shelter was often temporary, protection from extreme conditions was limited, and the ability to store or transport resources was constrained. This meant that the body itself became the primary interface between the individual and the environment, absorbing the effects of variation directly. Over time, repeated exposure to conditions that fall near or beyond the limits of physiological tolerance can influence survival, not through sudden failure, but through gradual reduction in resilience. Energy becomes more difficult to maintain, recovery from strain becomes slower, and the capacity to sustain effort over time may decrease. These changes do not always lead to immediate loss, but they can affect how individuals contribute to the group and how effectively the group maintains its continuity. From the perspective of human origins, these physiological limits were present from the beginning. The early human body evolved within specific environmental ranges, and while it developed flexibility, it did not become universally suited to all conditions. Movement into new environments introduced new combinations of temperature, altitude, resource availability, and disease exposure. Each of these factors interacts with the body in different ways, and the combined effect can challenge the balance that supports survival. Adaptation, both biological and behavioral, can extend the range of conditions that humans can tolerate, but this extension is not immediate. It unfolds over time, and during that period, individuals and groups may operate closer to the limits of what their bodies can sustain. Archaeological evidence, though indirect, reflects these constraints through patterns of settlement and activity. The distribution of human sites often corresponds to regions where environmental conditions align more closely with physiological tolerance. Areas that fall outside these ranges may show limited or intermittent occupation, suggesting that while humans could enter these spaces, maintaining long-term presence was more difficult. This pattern reinforces the idea that the body's limits influence not only individual survival, but also the broader distribution of human populations across space and time. When conditions become less aligned with these limits, the cost of survival increases, and this cost is reflected in how many individuals can be sustained within a given environment. When we return to the question of why so few humans were left alive, the role of the body becomes clearer. It is not only external pressures that shape population size, but also the internal capacity of individuals to endure those pressures. The human body does not provide an unlimited buffer against environmental variation. It offers a range of tolerance that can support survival under certain conditions, but when those conditions move beyond that range, the effects accumulate. In small populations where each individual matters, even a slight reduction in physical resilience can influence the continuity of the group. Over generations, this can contribute to a pattern where human numbers remain constrained, not because the environment alone limits growth, but because the body itself defines how much of that environment can be endured. The early human story in this sense is shaped by the interaction between the body and the world, where survival depends on maintaining a balance that is always close to its limits, and where that balance is not always sustained across time. The limits of the human body are not only tested by extremes, but also by the steady demands of daily life in environments where energy must be carefully balanced. Survival is not a single act, but a continuous process that requires the body to maintain its functions while responding to changing conditions. In early human contexts, energy was not stored in large reserves or supported by stable systems of supply. It was gathered, used, and replenished in cycles that depended closely on what the environment could provide at any given time. This creates a situation where the body is always operating near a threshold, adjusting between effort and recovery without a wide margin for fluctuation. When resources are limited or unevenly distributed, the balance between intake and expenditure becomes more difficult to maintain. A slight reduction in available food, or an increase in the effort required to obtain it, can shift this balance in ways that are not immediately visible but become significant over time. The body responds to such imbalances by reallocating energy, prioritizing certain functions while reducing others. This reallocation supports immediate survival, but it can also influence longer-term processes such as growth, repair, and reproduction. In small populations where continuity depends on the successful transition from one generation to the next, these longer-term processes are essential. When they are affected, even subtly, the impact can extend beyond the individual to the structure of the group. From the perspective of human origins, this balance between energy and function would have been a constant condition. Early humans did not live within systems that allowed for consistent surplus. Instead, they navigated environments where availability changed across seasons and across regions. This variability required flexibility, but flexibility itself carries a cost. Adjusting to different conditions means that the body must continually shift its internal balance, and each shift requires energy. Over time, repeated adjustments can influence overall resilience, especially when combined with other pressures such as environmental change and small group size. The body can sustain this process for a time, but it does not do so without consequence. Archaeological and biological evidence suggests that early human populations experienced variations in health and nutritional status that reflect these constraints. Differences in skeletal remains, for example, indicate periods where individuals may have experienced nutritional stress or fluctuations in growth. These patterns do not always correspond to single events, but to ongoing conditions where the balance between energy intake and expenditure was not consistently maintained. Such evidence reinforces the idea that survival was often achieved within narrow margins, where the body's ability to adapt was continuously engaged but not always fully supported by the environment. When we consider how this influences population size, the connection becomes more apparent. A population can only grow when the conditions that support reproduction and development are stable enough to sustain multiple generations. If energy balance is frequently disrupted, even in small ways, the cumulative effect can reduce the number of individuals who reach maturity and contribute to the next generation. This does not require a dramatic failure of the body. It can emerge from repeated periods where the balance is slightly negative, where recovery is incomplete, and where the capacity for sustained growth is limited. In small and isolated groups, these effects are more concentrated because there are fewer individuals to offset periods of reduced success. Over time, this can contribute to a pattern where population size remains low, not because individuals cannot survive, but because the conditions required for consistent growth are rarely maintained. In this way, the human body acts as both a means of survival and a boundary to expansion. Its ability to adapt allows humans to exist in a range of environments, but its dependence on energy balance limits how far that existence can extend without interruption. The early human story, when viewed through this lens, is shaped by the constant negotiation between what the body requires and what the environment provides. This negotiation does not always reach equilibrium, and when it does not, the effects accumulate across generations, influencing how many individuals can be sustained within a given context. The result is a pattern where human numbers remain constrained, shaped by the ongoing interaction between biological limits and environmental variability, each reinforcing the other in ways that are often gradual but persistent over long spans of time. Beyond the balance of energy, the human body is also shaped by the ways it responds to illness and injury, and these responses introduce another layer of limitation that becomes especially visible in small populations. The body has mechanisms to repair and defend itself, but these mechanisms are not absolute. They operate with varying effectiveness depending on conditions such as nutrition, stress, and exposure. In environments where these supporting conditions are not consistently maintained, the body's capacity to recover can be reduced. Illness does not need to be widespread to influence a group. In a small population, the impact of even a few individuals becoming less able to contribute can alter how the group functions over time. Recovery, when it occurs, may take longer, and during that time, the demands on others increase. This creates a shifting balance within the group. where the effects of individual strain are shared across a limited number of people. In early human contexts, exposure to pathogens was part of daily life, but it did not occur within large, dense populations where disease spreads rapidly in a single event. Instead, exposure was more intermittent, shaped by local conditions, contact with animals, and environmental factors. This pattern means that illness may not have reduced large numbers at once, but it could still influence the continuity of small groups through repeated localized effects. A sequence of minor illnesses, or a period where recovery is incomplete, can influence how individuals grow, how they contribute, and how they support the next generation. These effects are not always visible in a single moment, but they accumulate over time, shaping the overall resilience of the group. Injury introduces a similar dynamic. In environments where movement, resource gathering, and adaptation are constant requirements, the body is regularly exposed to physical strain. Minor injuries may heal, but during the process of recovery, the individual's ability to contribute is reduced. In a larger population, such reductions can be absorbed more easily, but in a small group, they have a more direct impact. Tasks must be redistributed, and the margin for error becomes smaller. If multiple individuals are affected over a short period, the cumulative effect can alter the group's ability to maintain its activities, even if no single injury is severe. From the perspective of human origins, these biological constraints were present alongside environmental variability and small group size. Early humans did not have access to consistent forms of care that could significantly extend recovery beyond what the body could achieve on its own. This means that the outcome of illness or injury was closely tied to immediate conditions and to the group's capacity to support the individual during recovery. In situations where resources were limited or conditions were unstable, this support may not always have been sufficient. The result is not necessarily a sudden loss, but a gradual reduction in capacity, where the group continues, but with less resilience than before. Archaeological evidence offers indirect indications of these processes through signs of healed injuries and variations in health across skeletal remains. Some individuals show evidence of recovery, suggesting that support and resilience were present to a certain extent. However, the variability in these patterns indicates that such outcomes were not consistent. Recovery depended on a combination of individual condition, group support, and environmental context. When these factors did not align, the effects of illness or injury could extend beyond the individual, influencing the group's ability to maintain continuity across generations. When we return to the broader question of why so few humans were left alive, these biological responses become part of a larger system of limitation. The human body is capable of enduring a range of challenges, but it does so within constraints that are shaped by both internal processes and external conditions. Illness and injury do not need to be catastrophic to influence population size. Their effects can be distributed over time, reducing resilience in ways that are subtle but persistent. In small populations, these reductions are more concentrated, and their impact on continuity is more pronounced. Over many generations, this contributes to a pattern where human numbers remain limited, not because survival is impossible, but because the conditions required for sustained resilience are not consistently met. The early human story, when viewed through this lens, reflects a balance that is continually tested, where the body's ability to recover and maintain itself interacts with the environment in ways that shape not only individual lives, but the broader trajectory of human presence across time. Movement, in the early human context, was not an expansion into open space, but a response to conditions that no longer supported continued presence in one place. When resources became less reliable, or when environmental patterns shifted beyond familiar limits, remaining still carried its own risks. Movement, therefore, was not optional. It was part of the process of maintaining continuity, a way of seeking conditions that might restore balance between what the body required and what the environment could provide. Yet this movement did not occur within a predictable or clearly defined path. It unfolded across landscapes that were only partially known, where each step introduced new variables rather than resolving uncertainty. The act of leaving one place did not guarantee that another would offer better conditions. It simply replaced one set of constraints with another. For small groups, this transition carried a particular weight. The knowledge that supported survival in one area was tied to specific patterns of land, water, and seasonal change. When a group moved beyond that familiar range, much of that knowledge became less directly applicable. New environments required new forms of understanding, and this understanding could not be established instantly. It developed through experience, through repeated interaction with the surroundings, and through the gradual recognition of patterns that were not immediately visible. During this period of adjustment, the group existed in a state of partial alignment with its environment, where some aspects of survival were supported while others remained uncertain. This state did not necessarily lead to immediate failure, but it reduced the margin for error, making the group more sensitive to additional pressures. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern of movement reflects a deeper condition. Early humans did not occupy a fixed territory from which they expanded outward in a continuous way. Instead, their presence shifted across different regions over time, following opportunities that were temporary rather than permanent. Movement was therefore not a sign of growth alone, but also a sign of limitation. It indicated that the previous conditions could no longer sustain the group, and that continuity required relocation. Each movement carried the possibility of establishing a new balance, but also the risk that such a balance would not be found. Over multiple generations, this creates a pattern where human presence is not anchored in a single place, but distributed across changing landscapes, with groups appearing in new areas while disappearing from others. Archaeological evidence supports this view through the shifting distribution of sites across time. Patterns of occupation often show sequences where one region is used for a period, followed by a decline, while another region shows increased activity. These shifts suggest that movement was a recurring process, driven by changing conditions rather than by a continuous expansion of population. The absence of long-term, stable occupation in many areas indicates that the environments did not support sustained presence without interruption. Instead, groups moved in response to changing availability, creating a dynamic pattern of settlement that reflects both adaptation and constraint. When we consider how movement influences the number of humans, its dual role becomes clearer. Movement can allow groups to avoid immediate pressures, to access new resources, and to extend their range. At the same time, it introduces uncertainty, reduces the effectiveness of existing knowledge, and requires energy that must be balanced against other needs. In small populations, these factors can limit the overall benefit of movement because the risks and costs are concentrated within a limited number of individuals. If movement does not lead to conditions that support sustained continuity, its effect may be temporary, providing short-term relief without contributing to long-term growth. This helps explain why movement does not necessarily lead to an increase in human numbers. Instead, it contributes to a pattern where populations remain small, shifting across space without accumulating into larger, more stable structures. The question of why so few humans were left alive is therefore linked not only to the conditions in which they lived, but also to the ways in which they moved through those conditions. Movement, while essential for survival, does not remove the limits imposed by environment and biology. It operates within those limits, redistributing human presence rather than expanding it in a continuous way. In this sense, early human movement reflects a balance between necessity and uncertainty, where each step forward carries both the potential for continuation and the possibility of further constraint, shaping a history in which human numbers remain limited across long spans of time. When movement becomes necessary, it does not occur all at once or in a single direction. It unfolds as a sequence of decisions made under uncertainty, where each step depends on what can be observed and remembered from the immediate surroundings. For early human groups, this meant that movement was often gradual, shaped by partial knowledge rather than a clear understanding of distant outcomes. A group might extend its range slightly, test a new area, and then either remain or move again depending on what it encounters. This pattern creates a form of movement that is fragmented, where progress is measured not by distance covered, but by the ability to maintain continuity while adjusting to new conditions. In such a process, the path taken is rarely direct, and the outcome is not guaranteed to lead to a more stable environment. Instead, each stage of movement introduces new constraints that must be managed alongside the existing ones. This gradual form of movement has implications for how resources are used and how the body responds to changing demands. As groups move, they must carry what they can, rely on what they find, and adjust to variations in terrain, climate, and availability. The effort required to move is not separate from the effort required to survive. It is part of the same system of energy balance that already operates near its limits. When movement is extended over time, this balance becomes more difficult to maintain because energy must be allocated not only to daily needs, but also to the act of relocation itself. This can reduce the margin for recovery, making individuals more susceptible to strain and reducing the overall resilience of the group. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reflects a broader limitation. Early humans did not possess the means to move large groups quickly or to transport significant resources across long distances. Movement was therefore constrained by what the group could sustain in the moment rather than by a long-term plan. This means that the scale of movement was often small and the connection between different groups remained limited. Even when groups moved into new areas, they did so as separate units, rather than as part of a coordinated expansion. This reinforces the fragmentation of human populations, as each group navigates its own path without forming a continuous network across space. Archaeological patterns provide indirect evidence of this form of movement through the distribution of sites that appear to shift over time without forming a single expanding frontier. Instead, the record suggests a mosaic of presence, where different areas are occupied at different times, reflecting local adjustments rather than a unified progression. This mosaic indicates that movement did not lead to a steady increase in occupied territory in a way that would support large population growth. Instead, it redistributed human presence across a landscape that remained only partially suitable for sustained habitation. When we consider how this affects the number of humans, the cumulative impact of movement becomes more apparent. Each stage of movement requires energy, introduces uncertainty, and reduces the effectiveness of existing knowledge. While movement can allow groups to avoid immediate limitations, it does not eliminate the underlying constraints that shape survival. In small populations, the costs of movement are more concentrated, and the potential benefits are more uncertain. If movement does not lead to conditions that support stable continuity, it may simply shift the location of a group without increasing its long-term resilience. Over multiple generations, this pattern contributes to a situation where human populations remain small, not because movement is ineffective, but because it operates within a system that limits sustained growth. The early human story, when viewed through this lens, is not one of expansion across a stable world, but of continuous adjustment within a world that offers only temporary opportunities. Movement becomes a way of maintaining presence rather than increasing it, a means of navigating constraints rather than overcoming them. In this context, the question of why so few humans were left alive reflects not a failure to move or to adapt, but the limits of what movement can achieve when it is shaped by uncertainty, constrained by energy, and carried out within small, isolated groups. Movement does not end when a group reaches a new place. It continues in a quieter form as the group begins to adjust its patterns within the unfamiliar environment. The first period after arrival is often marked by uncertainty, where the rhythms of the new landscape are not yet fully understood. Water sources may exist, but their reliability across seasons is not yet known. Food may be available, but its distribution and timing may differ from what the group has previously experienced. Shelter may be possible, but its effectiveness under different conditions has not been tested over time. This initial phase does not immediately determine success or failure, but it shapes how the group interacts with its surroundings in the early stages of settlement. During this time, decisions are made with incomplete knowledge, and those decisions influence how the group allocates its effort and attention. In small populations, the effects of these early adjustments are amplified. There are fewer individuals to explore different options, fewer opportunities to divide effort across multiple strategies, and fewer chances to recover from choices that do not align well with the environment. If a particular approach proves less effective, the group may not have the capacity to compensate quickly. This creates a period where the group exists within a narrow margin, where survival depends on gradually aligning behavior with the conditions of the new place. This alignment does not occur all at once. It develops through repeated interaction, through observation, and through the accumulation of experience that transforms unfamiliar patterns into something more predictable. Until that alignment is achieved, the group remains in a state of partial adjustment, where resilience is present but limited. From the perspective of human origins, This pattern of delayed alignment is part of the broader process of how humans spread across different environments. Early humans did not instantly become suited to every new region they entered. Instead, their presence in those regions was often provisional, dependent on their ability to adjust over time. Some groups may have reached a stable alignment with their environment, establishing patterns that could be maintained across generations. Others may have remained in a transitional state, where conditions never fully matched their needs, leading to eventual movement or disappearance. This variation contributes to the uneven distribution of human presence across space and time, where some areas show sustained occupation while others show only brief or intermittent use. Archaeological evidence reflects this through differences in the duration and intensity of site use. Some locations show signs of long-term occupation, suggesting that groups were able to establish a stable relationship with the environment. Other sites appear only briefly, indicating that while the area could be used for a time, it did not support continuous presence. These patterns suggest that movement into a new area did not guarantee long-term success, and that the process of adjustment was a critical factor in determining whether a group could remain. The absence of consistent occupation in many regions reinforces the idea that early human populations were continually navigating the boundary between temporary use and sustained habitation. When we consider how this influences the number of humans, the importance of this adjustment phase becomes clearer. A group that remains in a state of partial alignment for extended periods may continue to exist, but with reduced capacity for growth. The energy required to adjust, combined with the uncertainty of outcomes, limits the ability to expand beyond a certain size. If full alignment is never achieved, the group may persist only as long as conditions remain within a tolerable range, without building the stability needed for long-term increase. In this way, movement does not only carry risks during the journey itself, but also during the period that follows, where the success of relocation depends on a process that is gradual, uncertain, and not always completed. The early human story, seen through this lens, is shaped by repeated cycles of movement and adjustment, where each new place offers potential but also introduces new constraints. These cycles do not necessarily lead to accumulation or expansion. Instead, they create a pattern where human presence is maintained within limits, as groups move, adjust, and sometimes fail to establish lasting continuity. The question of why so few humans were left alive is therefore connected not only to the act of movement, but to the outcome of that movement, where the ability to align with new environments determines whether continuity can be sustained or remains temporary across the long span of early human history. What remains of early human presence is not a continuous record, but a pattern of traces that appear and disappear across different places and times. These traces do not tell a complete story on their own. They offer fragments, moments where human activity can be identified, followed by intervals where that activity is no longer visible. This absence does not always mean that humans were entirely gone from the world. It suggests that in specific regions, human groups were no longer present, or no longer leaving behind traces that could be preserved. The landscape in many cases returns to a state where the signs of human presence are minimal or absent, creating gaps that become visible only when viewed across longer spans of time. In this way, the archaeological record reflects not a steady accumulation of human activity, but a shifting pattern of occupation and absence. For small and isolated groups, this pattern is consistent with the structure of their existence. When a group maintains continuity in one place, it leaves behind traces that can be detected later. When that continuity ends, the traces do not continue. They do not extend into the next period unless another group arrives and occupies the same area. This creates a discontinuous record, where presence is followed by silence, and where the silence can last for extended periods. These gaps are not always linked to a single cause. They may result from a combination of environmental change, internal group dynamics, or movement to other regions. Because the groups are small, their disappearance does not produce large-scale evidence. It leaves behind an absence that must be interpreted through patterns rather than through direct observation. From the perspective of human origins, these traces are among the few ways to understand how early populations were distributed and how they changed over time. The earliest evidence of human presence appears in certain regions, and later evidence appears in others, but the connections between these occurrences are not always continuous. Instead of a single expanding line of occupation, the record suggests multiple points of presence that shift across the landscape. Some of these points persist for longer periods, while others are brief. The variation in duration reflects the differences in how well each group was able to align with its environment and maintain continuity. This uneven pattern reinforces the idea that human populations were not stable or uniformly distributed, but existed in a state of constant adjustment. Archaeological methods allow for the reconstruction of these patterns, but they also reveal the limits of what can be known. The absence of evidence in a particular region does not always mean complete absence of humans. It may reflect the loss of material traces, the conditions of preservation, or the scale of activity. However, when similar patterns of intermittent presence appear across multiple regions and time periods, they suggest that discontinuity was a common feature of early human existence. The repetition of appearance and disappearance indicates that groups were not consistently able to maintain their presence in specific locations, and that continuity was often interrupted. When this perspective is applied to the question of why so few humans were left alive, the archaeological record provides an indirect but meaningful answer. The pattern of traces suggests that human populations were frequently limited in size and distribution, and that their presence was not sustained uniformly across space and time. The gaps in the record are not empty in a simple sense. They represent periods where human continuity in a given place was not maintained, where groups may have moved, declined, or ended without leaving a continuous line of evidence. These gaps accumulate across regions, creating a broader picture where human presence is fragmented rather than continuous. In this way, the record does not show a world gradually filled with humans. It shows a world where human presence appears in certain places, persists for a time, and then fades, leaving behind traces that point to a history shaped by both persistence and absence. The number of humans at any given moment is therefore reflected not only in what is visible in the record, but also in what is not. The spaces between traces suggest limits to how many humans could be sustained and how consistently they could occupy different regions. This pattern aligns with the broader understanding that early human populations were small, dispersed, and subject to conditions that did not support continuous expansion. The traces that remain, and the gaps between them, together form a picture of a species whose presence was maintained through fragile continuities, where being present in one place did not guarantee presence in another, and where the overall number of humans remained constrained across long stretches of time. When we look more closely at how traces are preserved, another layer of uncertainty begins to shape the picture. Not every human presence leaves behind evidence that can survive long periods of time. The materials used, the duration of occupation, and the conditions of the surrounding environment all influence whether traces remain or disappear. In many early human contexts, tools were simple, shelters were temporary, and activities were spread across landscapes without creating dense accumulations of material. This means that even when humans were present, their presence may not have been recorded in a way that endures. The archaeological record, therefore, is not a complete reflection of all human activity. It is a filtered view, shaped by what could be preserved and later discovered. This filtering does not remove the broader patterns, but it adds a level of subtlety to how those patterns are interpreted. For small and mobile groups, this effect is even more pronounced. When a group occupies a place briefly, leaves minimal material, and then moves on, the likelihood of that occupation being preserved is reduced. Over time, natural processes such as erosion, sedimentation, and vegetation growth can further obscure or remove traces. As a result, the absence of evidence in certain areas may reflect both the fragility of human presence and the fragility of the record itself. These two forms of absence are not identical, but they interact in ways that reinforce the overall impression of discontinuity. The record does not show a dense or continuous pattern of human occupation, and this aligns with the understanding that populations were small, dispersed, and often temporary in their use of space. From the perspective of human origins, this means that our understanding of early populations must account for both what is visible and what is likely missing. The earliest humans did not create permanent structures or leave behind large accumulations of material that could be easily preserved. Their presence was often light, spread across wide areas, and dependent on immediate conditions. This form of presence does not lend itself to continuous recording. Instead, it appears in fragments, where certain conditions allowed traces to survive while others did not. These fragments, when combined, still suggest a pattern of limited and shifting populations, even if they do not capture every instance of human activity. Archaeological interpretation relies on comparing patterns across different regions and time periods to identify consistent features. When multiple areas show similar patterns of intermittent presence, with traces appearing and disappearing over time, this consistency suggests that the discontinuity is not solely an artifact of preservation. It reflects underlying processes that influenced how humans occupied the landscape. The combination of fragile material traces and fragile population structures creates a record that is both incomplete and informative. It does not provide a continuous narrative, but it reveals recurring features that point toward limited population size and unstable continuity. When we consider how this affects the question of why so few humans were left alive, the role of the archaeological record becomes clearer. It does not directly count individuals, but it reflects the density and persistence of human presence across space and time. Sparse and intermittent traces suggest that human populations were not only small, but also unable to maintain continuous occupation in many areas. The gaps in the record, shaped by both preservation and population dynamics, indicate that human presence was often temporary and localized. This reinforces the idea that early humans did not occupy the world in a dense or stable way, but moved within a landscape where their presence was limited by both environmental conditions and their own capacity to sustain continuity. The record, with its fragments and gaps, becomes a reflection of this condition, where what remains is only a partial view of a broader pattern defined by small numbers and repeated interruptions. In this way, the absence of continuous evidence does not weaken the understanding of early human populations. It supports it by showing that both the traces and the populations themselves were shaped by fragility, leaving behind a history that must be read through what is present and what is missing at the same time. When traces are assembled across regions and time periods, they do not align into a single continuous line. Instead, they form a pattern of scattered points that must be connected through careful interpretation. Each site provides a moment where human presence can be confirmed, but the connections between these moments are often indirect. The distance between sites, both in space and in time, creates intervals that cannot be filled with certainty. These intervals are not empty in the sense that nothing occurred. They are spaces where the continuity of human presence cannot be directly observed, and where the processes that shaped that continuity must be inferred from patterns rather than from continuous evidence. This structure of the record reflects the nature of early human populations, where presence was not evenly distributed, and where continuity was often local rather than widespread. For small and isolated groups, the absence of direct connections between sites mirrors the absence of strong connections between populations. A group occupying one region may have little or no interaction with a group in another region, even if both are part of the same broader species. The archaeological record in this sense preserves the separation as much as it preserves the presence. The lack of continuous evidence between sites suggests that human populations were not forming a dense network across the landscape. Instead, they existed as separate clusters, each with its own history, its own duration, and its own endpoint. When one cluster ends, its traces remain, but the continuation of human presence depends on other clusters elsewhere. This creates a pattern where the overall presence of humans is maintained, but only through the combined effect of many independent and fragile continuities. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reinforces the idea that early human expansion was not a unified process. The emergence of our species did not lead to an immediate and continuous spread across all available environments. Instead, it produced a series of local expansions and contractions, where groups moved, settled, and sometimes disappeared without creating a continuous line of occupation. The gaps between these occurrences are part of the structure of early human history, reflecting the limits of population size, mobility, and environmental alignment. These limits do not produce a smooth progression. They produce a landscape of presence that is uneven, shifting, and often interrupted. Archaeological methods attempt to bridge these gaps through dating techniques and comparative analysis, but even with these tools, the record remains incomplete. The intervals between sites can be estimated, but not fully reconstructed. This incompleteness is not simply a limitation of evidence, it is a reflection of the processes that shaped early human populations. The same factors that limited population size and continuity also limited the accumulation of material that could be preserved. As a result, the record we observe is both a product of human activity and a product of the constraints under which that activity occurred. When we return to the question of why so few humans were left alive, the fragmented nature of the record offers a consistent perspective. It suggests that human populations were not only small, but also discontinuous across both space and time. The absence of direct connections between many sites indicates that continuity was not widespread, but localized, and that the overall number of humans was the result of many separate groups maintaining their presence independently. The gaps between these groups, reflected in the gaps in the record, point to the limits of expansion and the frequency of interruption. This does not imply a single moment of near disappearance, but a recurring condition where human presence was repeatedly reduced, redistributed, and re-established in different places. In this way, the archaeological record, with its scattered points and uncertain connections, becomes a reflection of a broader reality. It shows a species that persisted, but within narrow bounds, where continuity depended on multiple fragile lines rather than a single unbroken path. The number of humans at any given time emerges from this pattern, shaped by the combined presence of groups that were often separated, often temporary, and always influenced by conditions that did not allow for continuous and stable growth across the full extent of the early human world. Distance, in the early human world, was not measured only in physical space. It was also defined by the limits of movement, the risks of travel, and the absence of reliable pathways that could connect one group to another. Two groups could exist within what now seems like a short distance, yet remain effectively isolated from each other for long periods of time. The landscape between them might contain barriers that are not immediately visible as obstacles, such as changes in terrain, variations in climate, or the absence of consistent resources along the way. Crossing these spaces required not only effort, but also knowledge that might not have been available, and the willingness to accept uncertainty that could not be easily reduced. In such conditions, distance becomes a factor that separates populations not only geographically, but also in their experience of the world. For small groups, this separation has direct consequences. When groups are isolated, they cannot rely on one another for support during periods of difficulty. A shortage of resources, a change in environmental conditions, or a reduction in group size cannot be offset by drawing from a larger network. Each group must manage its own conditions independently, and the outcomes of that management remain local. This independence reinforces the fragmentation already present in early human populations. Instead of forming a connected system where stability can be shared, groups remain separated, each one subject to its own set of pressures. The overall number of humans is therefore not supported by a unified structure, but by the combined presence of many independent groups, each vulnerable to disruption. From the perspective of human origins, this isolation is not an exception, but a defining feature of early population structure. The first humans did not expand into a world where connections could be easily maintained across long distances. Their movement was constrained by the need to remain within environments that could support them, and by the limits of their own bodies and resources. As a result, even as humans spread into new regions, the connections between groups remained weak. Contact may have occurred at times, but it was not consistent or widespread enough to create a stable network of interaction. This means that the flow of knowledge, resources, and individuals between groups was limited, and that each group largely depended on its own internal capacity to sustain continuity. Archaeological evidence reflects this pattern through variations in material culture and the uneven distribution of sites. Differences in tools and practices across regions suggest that groups develop their own ways of interacting with their environments, with limited exchange between them. The absence of uniformity indicates that connections were not strong enough to maintain consistent patterns across large areas. This variability reinforces the idea that distance created separation not only in space, but also in how groups lived and adapted. When we consider how this affects the number of humans, the role of isolation becomes more apparent. A connected population can absorb local losses and redistribute resources, allowing for greater stability over time. An isolated population cannot. Each group's survival depends on its own conditions, and when those conditions become unfavorable, there is little opportunity for recovery through external support. Over time, this leads to a pattern where groups appear and disappear independently, and where the overall number of humans remains constrained by the limited capacity of each group to sustain itself. In this way, distance acts as a silent boundary, shaping the structure of early human populations. It limits interaction, reduces the potential for collective resilience, and reinforces the fragmentation that keeps populations small. The question of why so few humans were left alive is therefore closely tied to this separation. It reflects a world where human presence was distributed across isolated points, where connections were weak, and where survival was determined locally rather than collectively. Within such a system, the number of humans does not accumulate easily, because the structure required for sustained growth is interrupted by the distances that separate one group from another, leaving each to navigate its own path within a landscape that does not bring them together in a consistent or lasting way. When distance separates groups over long periods, it does more than prevent contact. It shapes how each group develops in relation to its own environment, creating differences that are not easily bridged when contact does occur. Each group learns from repeated experience within its own range, forming patterns of movement, resource use, and seasonal adjustment that reflect the specific conditions it encounters. Over time, these patterns become stable within the group, not because they are universally effective, but because they align with the local environment. When two such groups are separated by distance, their ways of living may gradually diverge, even if they share a common origin. This divergence does not require conscious direction. It emerges from the accumulation of small adaptations, each shaped by local conditions. When contact eventually becomes possible, these differences can influence how easily knowledge or practices are shared, and whether such sharing can support continuity in a meaningful way. In early human contexts where groups were small and interactions were infrequent, the potential for exchange was limited not only by distance, but also by the differences that distance allowed to develop. These differences do not necessarily prevent interaction, but they reduce its immediate effectiveness as a source of support. A strategy that works well in one environment may not transfer directly to another, and the time required to adapt shared knowledge to new conditions may extend beyond the period in which it is needed. This means that even when groups come into contact, the benefits of that contact are not always sufficient to offset local pressures. The connection may be brief, partial, or uneven in its effects, and it may not create a lasting link that can be relied upon in future periods of difficulty. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reinforces the fragmentation of early populations. The emergence of our species did not occur within a fully connected network where knowledge and individuals could move freely across regions. Instead, it took place within a landscape of partial connections, where groups were linked at times but not consistently enough to form a stable structure of exchange. This partial connectivity means that the advantages of shared knowledge and cooperation were present, but limited in their reach. They could support continuity within certain areas or periods, but they did not extend across the entire population in a way that would significantly increase overall stability. Archaeological evidence provides indirect insight into this process through variations in material culture that appear across different regions. Differences in tool design, resource use, and habitation patterns suggest that groups develop distinct approaches to their environments. While some similarities indicate occasional contact or shared origins, the persistence of differences suggests that interaction was not frequent or extensive enough to create uniformity. This variability aligns with the idea that distance allowed groups to develop independently, reinforcing separation rather than reducing it. When we consider how this influences the number of humans, the effect of divergence becomes clearer. A population that is divided into many distinct groups, each adapted to its own conditions, does not function as a unified whole. The success of one group does not easily translate into support for another, and the knowledge that sustains one group may not be directly applicable elsewhere. This limits the ability of the population to accumulate advantages across its full extent. Instead, each group must maintain its own continuity within its own context, and the overall number of humans remains the sum of these separate efforts. In such a system, growth is not shared or reinforced across distances. It is localized, and therefore more vulnerable to interruption. The question of why so few humans were left alive can therefore be understood not only in terms of physical isolation, but also in terms of the differences that isolation produces. Distance does not simply separate groups. It allows them to become distinct in ways that limit the effectiveness of connection when it does occur. This creates a population structure where continuity is maintained within small localized contexts, but not extended across a broader network. Over time, this reinforces the pattern of small and fragmented populations, where the number of humans remains limited by the lack of consistent and effective connections between groups, each one shaped by its own environment and its own path through a world that does not easily bring them together. Even when the physical distance between groups becomes smaller, the absence of consistent pathways can maintain separation in ways that are not immediately visible. Movement across a landscape does not depend only on how far one place is from another, but on whether there are routes that can be followed with some degree of predictability. In early human environments, such pathways were not fixed or maintained. They were shaped by seasonal patterns, by the distribution of water and food, and by the conditions of terrain that could change over time. A route that was possible in one period might become less reliable in another, not because the distance changed, but because the conditions that supported travel no longer aligned in the same way. This creates a situation where proximity does not guarantee connection, and where groups that are relatively close can remain effectively separated across multiple generations. For small populations, this lack of stable pathways has direct consequences for continuity. Without predictable routes, contact between groups becomes irregular, dependent on conditions that do not occur consistently. Encounters may happen at certain times, when conditions allow movement across shared spaces, but these encounters are not guaranteed to repeat. As a result, the formation of lasting connections is limited, and the exchange of individuals, knowledge, or resources remains sporadic. This sporadic contact does not create a network that can support stability across the population. Instead, it reinforces a pattern where groups remain largely independent, with only occasional points of interaction that do not significantly alter their long-term separation. From the perspective of human origins, this condition reflects the broader structure of early human movement. The first humans did not travel along established routes that connected distant regions in a consistent manner. Their movement followed shifting opportunities, where the presence of resources and the conditions of the environment determined which paths were possible at any given time. This means that the connections between groups were not fixed, but emerged and disappeared along with the conditions that made them possible. Over long periods, this creates a landscape of intermittent connectivity, where groups are linked at certain moments and separated at others, without forming a stable pattern that could support continuous interaction. Archaeological evidence offers indirect support for this through the uneven distribution of similarities and differences across regions. In some cases, shared features suggest that groups came into contact and exchanged ideas or practices. In other cases, distinct differences persist over long periods, indicating that such contact was limited or absent. The lack of consistent patterns across regions suggests that connections were not stable enough to create a unified system of interaction. Instead, they reflect a series of temporary links that did not extend across the full extent of early human populations. When we consider how this influences the number of humans, the role of pathways becomes clearer. A population that can maintain regular contact across distances has the potential to redistribute individuals, share resources, and support recovery from local challenges. A population without such pathways cannot do so reliably. Each group must rely primarily on its own capacity to sustain continuity, and the benefits of occasional contact are not sufficient to create long-term stability. This limits the overall resilience of the population, keeping numbers constrained even when some groups are successful in maintaining themselves. In this way, the absence of stable pathways acts as a quiet but persistent boundary, shaping how human populations are structured across space. It reinforces the effects of distance and divergence, ensuring that groups remain separated not only by how far apart they are, but by how difficult it is to move between them in a consistent and reliable way. The question of why so few humans were left alive can therefore be understood as a result of this layered separation, where distance, divergence, and the absence of pathways combine to limit the formation of a connected population. Within such a system, human presence is maintained through many small independent groups, each navigating its own conditions, and each contributing to a total number that remains limited by the lack of sustained and predictable connections across the broader landscape of early human history. The continuation of a human group depends on more than its presence in a single moment. It depends on whether that presence can be carried forward through a sequence of generations without interruption. Each generation must not only survive, but also reach a point where it can contribute to the next, creating a chain that extends across time. In large and stable populations, this chain can absorb small disruptions, because there are many individuals who can sustain continuity even when some are lost. In small and isolated groups, the chain is thinner, and the margin for interruption is narrow. The loss of continuity does not require a dramatic event. It can occur through a series of small changes that, when combined, reduce the ability of a group to sustain itself across generations. This process is not always visible within a single generation. A group may appear stable for a time, maintaining its activities and passing on its practices. However, if the number of individuals contributing to the next generation is slightly reduced, or if the balance between age groups shifts in a way that limits effective transmission, the effects may only become clear later. The chain continues but with less strength, and each subsequent link becomes more dependent on conditions aligning in a precise way. Over time, this creates a situation where continuity is maintained not by stability, but by repeated alignment of factors that are not guaranteed to occur consistently. From the perspective of human origins, this fragile chain was part of the initial condition of our species. Early human groups did not have large populations to reinforce continuity across multiple generations. Each group depended on its own internal structure and its ability to maintain a sufficient number of individuals who could carry the chain forward. This means that the continuation of human populations was not a broad and secure process, but a series of localized sequences, each one vulnerable to interruption. The overall number of humans was therefore shaped by how many of these sequences could be maintained at the same time, and how long each could persist before being altered or ended. Archaeological evidence, while indirect, suggests that such interruptions were not uncommon. Variations in site occupation and the appearance and disappearance of cultural patterns indicate that continuity was not always sustained in a uniform way. Some sequences of occupation extend over longer periods, suggesting that groups were able to maintain continuity across multiple generations. Others appear shorter, indicating that the chain may have been interrupted, whether through movement, reduction in group size, or other factors that limited continuation. These patterns do not provide a complete record of generational change, but they reflect the outcomes of processes that influenced how continuity was maintained or lost over time. When we consider how this fragile chain affects the number of humans, its importance becomes clear. A population can only grow when the chain of generations remains intact across multiple cycles. If the chain is frequently interrupted, even in small ways, the overall effect is a limitation on long-term expansion. Each interruption reduces the number of individuals who can contribute to future generations, and in small populations, this reduction is more difficult to recover from. Over extended periods, this creates a pattern where the number of humans remains constrained, not because individuals cannot survive in the short term, but because the continuity required for sustained growth is not consistently maintained. In this way, the question of why so few humans were left alive can be understood through the structure of generational continuity. The human story, in its early stages, was not built upon a single unbroken chain, but upon many fragile sequences, each one extending for a time and then, in some cases, ending. The total number of humans at any given moment reflects the sum of these sequences, shaped by how many were able to continue and how many were interrupted. This creates a history where presence is maintained, but within limits, where the continuation of life depends on conditions that must align repeatedly across generations, and where the absence of such alignment can quietly reduce the number of humans without a single defining event. Even when a generational chain continues without a clear break, its strength can vary in ways that influence how effectively it supports long-term continuity. A sequence of generations is not simply a count of individuals passing through time. It is a structure that depends on how those individuals are able to grow, learn, and contribute within the conditions they encounter. When the conditions are stable enough, each generation can build upon what came before, maintaining a certain level of continuity in knowledge and behavior. When conditions shift, this process becomes less direct. Each generation must adjust not only to its environment, but also to the limitations inherited from previous generations. These limitations may not be immediately visible, but they shape how effectively knowledge is transmitted and how consistently practices can be maintained. In small and isolated groups, this variation in generational strength becomes more significant. There are fewer individuals to carry forward knowledge, fewer opportunities for redundancy, and fewer chances to correct for gaps that may arise. If certain skills or practices are not fully transferred, the next generation may need to reconstruct them through experience, which takes time and may not always lead to the same outcome. This process introduces variability into the chain, where continuity is maintained, but not in a uniform or stable way. Over multiple generations, this variability can influence how effectively a group responds to changing conditions and how resilient it remains when faced with new challenges. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reflects the broader condition of early populations. The first humans did not inherit a fully developed and stable set of practices that could be applied across all environments. Their ways of living were shaped by local conditions and by the gradual accumulation of experience within each group. As groups moved or as environments changed, the process of transmission became more complex because what needed to be passed on was no longer fully aligned with what the next generation would encounter. This creates a situation where each generation carries forward a partial alignment between knowledge and environment, requiring further adjustment to maintain continuity. Archaeological evidence provides indirect support for this through changes in material culture over time. Variations in tool forms, resource use, and patterns of habitation suggest that practices were not static, but adapted across generations in response to shifting conditions. These changes do not always indicate progress in a linear sense. In some cases, they reflect a narrowing of options or a shift towards strategies that are less diverse but more immediately viable. Such patterns suggest that continuity was maintained through adjustment rather than through stable transmission, and that the strength of the generational chain varied over time. When we consider how this affects the number of humans, the role of generational strength becomes clearer. A population can only expand when each generation not only survives, but also maintains or improves its capacity to support the next. If the strength of the chain fluctuates, with periods where transmission is less effective or where adaptation is incomplete, the overall capacity for growth is reduced. This does not necessarily lead to immediate decline, but it can limit the rate at which populations increase and make them more vulnerable to additional pressures. In small populations, these effects are more pronounced because there are fewer individuals to offset periods of reduced generational strength. Over long spans of time, this contributes to a pattern where human numbers remain within a constrained range, shaped by the variability of continuity rather than by a steady accumulation of growth. The question of why so few humans were left alive can therefore be understood not only in terms of whether the generational chain continues, but also in terms of how strong that chain is at different points in time. Continuity that is maintained with reduced strength can sustain presence, but may not support expansion. It can carry a group forward, but within limits that reflect the challenges of maintaining alignment between knowledge, environment, and biological capacity. In this way, early human populations are shaped by a sequence of generations that do not all contribute equally to long-term growth, creating a history where survival is achieved, but where the number of humans remains limited by the uneven strength of the chains that connect one generation to the next. When the chain of generations becomes thin, its continuity depends on conditions aligning in ways that are not always visible in advance. A small group may carry its sequence forward across several generations, but this continuation is not secured by the past alone. Each new generation must reach a point where it can sustain the next, and this requires a balance between survival, development, and the transfer of knowledge. In early human populations, this balance was often maintained within narrow margins. A slight shift in conditions, a reduction in available resources, or a change in group structure could influence how many individuals were able to contribute to the next stage of the sequence. These influences do not always produce immediate breaks, but they can reduce the density of the chain, making each subsequent generation more dependent on favorable conditions. Over time, this creates a pattern where continuity is preserved, but with increasing fragility. This fragility becomes more pronounced when multiple pressures occur in sequence rather than at the same time. A group may pass through a period where resources are limited but manageable, followed by another period where environmental conditions shift, and then another where internal structure becomes less stable. Each of these phases may be survivable on its own, but when they occur across successive generations, their effects can accumulate. The chain continues, but with fewer individuals contributing, and with less capacity to absorb further variation. This cumulative narrowing does not require a single defining event. It emerges from the interaction of multiple small pressures that extend across time, shaping the sequence of generations in ways that are gradual but persistent. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reflects the broader condition under which early populations existed. The emergence of our species did not occur within a stable framework that would allow generational continuity to strengthen consistently. Instead, it unfolded within a system where each generation faced its own combination of constraints, and where the outcomes of those constraints influenced the next stage of the sequence. The continuation of human populations depended on the repeated alignment of factors that were not guaranteed to occur in the same way across different times and places. This means that continuity was not only fragile, but also variable, shaped by conditions that could support it in one period and weaken it in another. Archaeological patterns provide indirect evidence of this cumulative effect through the uneven duration of site occupation and the shifting presence of cultural features. Some sequences of occupation extend across longer spans, suggesting that conditions allowed for a more stable chain of generations. Others are shorter, indicating that the chain may have thinned to a point where continuity could not be maintained. These variations do not always correspond to large-scale environmental changes, suggesting that the cumulative effects of smaller pressures played a role in shaping how long groups could persist in a given place. When we consider how this cumulative thinning influences the number of humans, its impact becomes clear. A population does not need to experience a single dramatic reduction to remain small. It can remain limited through the gradual narrowing of generational chains, where each sequence contributes fewer individuals to the overall total. In small and isolated groups, this effect is more concentrated, because there are fewer parallel sequences to offset periods of reduced continuity. The overall number of humans is therefore shaped not only by how many groups exist, but by how robust each group's generational chain remains over time. If many chains are thin or weakening, the total number remains constrained, even if some continuity is maintained. The question of why so few humans were left alive can thus be understood as a reflection of these cumulative processes. It is not only about whether generations continue, but about how much each generation contributes to sustaining and extending that continuity. When contributions are reduced across successive generations, the overall pattern remains one of limited expansion, where survival is achieved but growth is moderated by the persistent narrowing of the chains that carry human presence forward. In this way, early human history reflects a balance that is continually shaped by small accumulating effects, where the absence of strong and consistent generational continuity keeps populations within a range that does not easily expand beyond the limits set by environment, biology, and structure. If we shift from what can be observed in landscapes and archaeological traces to what is carried within the human body itself, another kind of record begins to appear. This record is not written in visible artifacts, but in patterns of inherited variation that persist across generations. The study of these patterns suggests that human populations did not remain large and continuous throughout their history. Instead, there are indications that at certain times, the number of individuals contributing to future generations was relatively limited. These periods are not defined by a single location or event, but by the structure of inheritance itself, where the diversity carried forward reflects a narrower set of ancestors than might be expected from a large and stable population. This does not mean that all humans were reduced to a single small group at one moment, but it suggests that over time, the effective number of individuals shaping the future of the population was constrained. In small and fragmented populations, such patterns are consistent with the limits already observed in environmental and archaeological contexts. When groups are isolated and their numbers are low, the range of variation passed on to the next generation is influenced by the size and structure of those groups. If only a limited number of individuals contribute to future generations, the diversity of inherited traits becomes more concentrated. Over time, this can create a signal that reflects periods where population size was effectively reduced, even if individuals were distributed across different regions. This reduction is not always visible in the short term, but it becomes detectable when patterns are examined across many generations. From the perspective of human origins, these patterns of inherited variation provide a complementary view of population history. Early humans did not exist within a fully connected network where variation could be freely exchanged across large distances. Instead, they were part of a system where isolation, small group size, and environmental constraints limited how variation was distributed. This means that the genetic record carries traces of these limitations, showing that human populations experience phases where the pool of contributing individuals was relatively narrow. These phases align with the broader understanding that early human numbers were not consistently large, but fluctuated within a constrained range shaped by multiple factors. Scientific interpretations of these patterns are careful to avoid assigning precise numbers or specific causes without sufficient evidence. The signals observed in inherited variation indicate that population sizes were sometimes limited, but they do not point to a single, clearly defined event that explains all such reductions. Instead, they are consistent with a model where populations experience repeated phases of contraction and expansion, influenced by environmental conditions, movement, and the internal structure of groups. This perspective avoids the need to identify a single moment when humans were nearly lost, and instead suggests that the narrowing of populations was a recurring feature of early human history. When we consider how this internal record relates to the question of why so few humans were left alive, it adds another dimension to the answer. It suggests that the limitation of population size was not only visible in external patterns of presence and absence, but also embedded in the way variation was passed forward across generations. The body itself carries a history of constraint, reflecting periods where the number of individuals shaping the future was relatively small. This does not indicate failure in a simple sense. It reflects the conditions under which early humans lived, where continuity was maintained through small, isolated groups navigating a changing environment. In this way, the internal record of inherited variation aligns with the external evidence, both pointing toward a history where human populations remained limited over long periods. The number of humans was shaped not by a single reduction, but by a pattern of constrained continuity, where the contributions of each generation were drawn from a relatively narrow base. This reinforces the idea that early human existence was defined by small numbers and fragile connections, where survival was achieved, but within limits that are still visible in the patterns carried within the human body today. The inherited record of human populations does not speak in the language of events. It does not tell us that one specific disaster reduced all people at once, nor does it give a complete map of where every group lived. What it reveals instead is a pattern of narrowing, where the diversity carried forward into later generations appears more limited than would be expected if humans had remained numerous, widely connected, and continuously expanding across long stretches of time. This narrowing is important because it shifts the question away from the search for a single dramatic cause. It suggests that what shaped early human numbers may have been less like a sudden collapse and more like a repeated passage through small population structures, where only part of the existing variation continued into the future. In this sense, the inherited record does not describe one moment when humans were almost gone. It points to a history in which the effective pool of ancestors remained restricted, often enough to leave a lasting trace. This pattern becomes easier to understand when placed beside the earlier picture of small and isolated groups. If human populations were divided across landscapes into separate clusters, and if contact between those clusters was limited, then the diversity of the species as a whole would not move freely or evenly. Some forms of variation would remain local, some would disappear when local groups ended, and some would spread only if later movement or contact allowed it. Over many generations, this means that the diversity visible in later humans would reflect not all of the humans who once existed, but only those whose lines of continuity continued under conditions that allowed them to contribute to the future. A population may appear present across a broad area, yet still leave behind a relatively narrow inherited legacy if many of its local lines fail to continue across deep time. From the perspective of human origins, this matters because it suggests that survival and contribution were not the same thing. Many humans may have lived, adapted, and endured for a time in their own places, yet only some of those lines became part of the longer continuity that reaches later populations. This is a quieter and more sobering view of the past. It means that early human existence cannot be understood only by asking who survived in the short term. It must also be understood by asking whose descendants remained part of the longer chain. The inherited record reflects this second question. It shows that the future of the species was shaped by a narrower stream than the full breadth of all earlier human lives. This does not reduce the reality of those lost lines, but it does explain why later variation carries the signal of limitation. Scientific interpretations of this narrowing remain cautious for good reason. Genetic patterns can suggest that ancestral population structure was limited at certain times, but they do not always allow precise reconstruction of exactly how many groups existed, how widely they were spread, or what local conditions led some lines to continue while others did not. The signals are shaped by migration, separation, reconnection, and long spans of time over which many processes overlap. Because of this, it is more accurate to speak of repeated narrowing and constrained continuity than to claim a single universal bottleneck with one clear explanation. This caution is not a weakness in the evidence. It is part of what makes the picture more reliable. It keeps the answer tied to what is broadly supported, that human populations were, for long periods, structured in ways that limited how much ancestral variation flowed forward into the future. When this is brought back to the central question, it helps refine what it means to ask why so few humans were left alive. The answer is not only that populations were small in a physical sense, it is also that the stream of ancestry moving forward was often narrower than the wider field of lives that once existed. Many groups may have appeared, endured briefly, and then left little or no continuing contribution to later populations. What remains in the inherited record is therefore not the memory of all human presence, but the compressed result of those lines that passed through time successfully enough to remain. Early human history, seen through this lens, becomes a long process of filtering, where presence was broader than continuity, and continuity was broader than contribution. The number of humans that truly shaped the future was therefore limited not only by who lived, but by who remained connected to the long and fragile chain that continued. If we continue to follow this internal record across longer spans of time, a final layer begins to emerge, one that connects the narrowing of ancestry with the broader conditions under which early humans lived. The inherited patterns do not show a single, continuous expansion from the first appearance of our species. Instead, they reflect a sequence where continuity is maintained through a limited set of contributing lines, while other lines, though once present, do not extend forward. This creates a form of uneven continuity, where the presence of humans at any given time may have been broader than the portion of that presence that continues into the future. In this sense, the inherited record does not preserve the full scale of early human existence. It preserves the part that remained connected across many generations, shaped by conditions that allowed those connections to persist. This unevenness is consistent with the broader picture of small, isolated groups moving through changing environments. If groups were frequently separated, adapting to local conditions, and sometimes ending without direct continuation, then the inherited record would naturally reflect a reduced set of lines that successfully bridged multiple phases of environmental and structural change. Each successful line represents not only survival in a single context, but the ability to remain aligned with conditions across successive contexts, where environments, resources, and group structures were not stable. This alignment is not guaranteed, and it does not occur uniformly across all groups. It is a process that selects for continuity under specific conditions, leaving other forms of continuity unrepresented in later generations. From the perspective of human origins, this suggests that the early human population was not only small in number, but also uneven in its contribution to the future. The emergence of our species created many local lines of existence, but only some of these lines became part of the longer continuity that leads to later populations. This does not imply that the other lines were less viable in their own time. They may have been well adapted to their environments and sustained for multiple generations. However, when conditions changed, or when connections between groups were limited, their continuity may not have extended far enough to become part of the inherited record that persists. Archaeological and genetic perspectives, when considered together, reinforce this interpretation. The discontinuous nature of site occupation suggests that many groups did not maintain long-term presence in a single location, while genetic patterns suggest that not all lines contributed equally to later populations. These two forms of evidence do not provide a complete account of every group, but they align in showing that early human continuity was selective and uneven. The combination of environmental change, small population size, limited connectivity, and biological constraints created a system where only certain lines could persist across extended periods. When we return to the central question, this layered understanding helps clarify what it means to say that so few humans were left alive. It is not only about how many individuals existed at a given moment, but about how many lines of continuity were able to extend across time. The inherited record shows that this number was limited, reflecting a history where continuity was repeatedly filtered through conditions that did not support all existing groups equally. Early human populations were therefore shaped by both presence and loss, where the visible traces of survival are accompanied by an underlying pattern of narrowing that determined which lines would remain part of the future. In this way, the human story is carried forward not by the full range of past existence, but by a subset that successfully navigated the constraints of environment, biology, and structure. This does not reduce the complexity of early human life. It highlights it, showing that the path from past to present was not a wide and continuous flow, but a series of narrow passages, where continuity depended on alignment with conditions that were always changing and rarely stable. The number of humans that shaped what came next was therefore limited, not by a single event, but by a long process in which many possibilities existed, but only some were carried forward across the shifting landscape of early human history. Survival, when viewed across long stretches of early human history, does not always lead to expansion. It can exist as a condition in which populations persist without significantly increasing, maintaining their presence within limits that are not easily overcome. This form of survival is not defined by progress in a modern sense. It is defined by the ability to continue under conditions that remain close to the thresholds of what can be sustained. A group may endure for many generations, adapting to its environment, maintaining its practices, and preserving its continuity, yet still remain small in number. This persistence does not accumulate into large populations because the conditions that support it do not extend far enough or long enough to allow for consistent growth. Instead, survival becomes a form of stability within constraint, where the number of individuals remains within a range that reflects the limits of the environment and the structure of the group. In such a context, the idea of improvement or advancement must be understood differently. Adaptations that support survival do not always lead to increased capacity for growth. They may allow a group to remain aligned with its environment, but only within the specific conditions in which those adaptations are effective. When those conditions shift, the same adaptations may need to be adjusted or replaced, and the process begins again. This creates a pattern where survival is maintained through continuous adjustment rather than through accumulation. Each generation inherits a way of living that works within a certain range, and when that range changes, the process of adaptation resumes. The outcome is not a steady progression toward greater stability, but a repeated return to balance within new conditions. From the perspective of human origins, this pattern reflects the broader structure of early populations. The first humans did not experience a rapid and sustained increase in numbers following their emergence. Instead, they existed within environments that imposed limits on how far and how consistently populations could expand. Even when conditions were favorable, those conditions were often temporary or localized. A group might experience a period of relative stability, where resources were sufficient and continuity could be maintained. But such periods did not always extend across wider regions or longer durations. When conditions changed, the group would return to a state of adjustment, maintaining its presence but not necessarily increasing its size. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation through the lack of continuous and widespread expansion in early periods. The record does not show a steady increase in site density across all regions. Instead, it shows patterns of occupation that remain limited in scale, with certain areas supporting human presence for a time and others showing only intermittent use. This suggests that survival was often achieved without leading to large, connected populations. The absence of continuous expansion is not a sign of failure, but a reflection of the conditions under which early humans lived. Those conditions supported persistence, but within limits that did not allow for sustained growth across broad areas. When we consider how this form of survival influences the number of humans, the implications become clearer. A population that persists without expanding will remain small, even over long periods of time. If many groups exist in this state simultaneously, the total number of humans may increase slightly, but it will not do so in a way that leads to large and stable populations. Instead, the overall number remains constrained, shaped by the combined effect of many groups maintaining themselves within limited conditions. This helps explain why early human populations could remain low in number for extended periods, not because survival was impossible, but because the conditions required for growth were rarely sustained. In this way, the question of why so few humans were left alive can be understood through the distinction between survival and expansion. Early humans were capable of surviving, adapting, and maintaining continuity, but these capacities did not automatically translate into larger populations. They operated within a framework that allowed persistence, but not continuous accumulation. The human story in its early stages is therefore one of endurance within limits, where survival is achieved repeatedly, but where the number of individuals remains shaped by conditions that do not support ongoing and widespread growth across the long span of early human history. A population can remain alive for a very long time without becoming secure, and this distinction matters when we try to understand early human history. Security implies more than survival in the present. It implies a buffer against future disruption, a capacity to absorb loss without threatening continuity, and a structure that can carry growth forward even when conditions become less favorable. Early human groups rarely seem to have possessed that kind of security for long. What they appear to have achieved instead is a more fragile condition. Repeated continuation without a strong margin of safety. They could remain present, sometimes across many generations, but still exist close to the point where change in the environment, reduction in group size, or interruption in transmission could alter their future. This means that survival, even when prolonged, did not necessarily create a foundation for expansion. It often produced a form of persistence that was real, but narrow. In such a condition, time does not automatically strengthen a population. It can simply extend the period during which the population continues under the same constraints. A group that survives for many generations in a limited range, with limited resources and weak connections to other groups, may become more experienced in maintaining its way of life, but it does not necessarily become less vulnerable. Experience helps, but it remains tied to the conditions under which it was formed. If those conditions shift, the knowledge that supported persistence may no longer provide the same stability. This means that long survival does not always accumulate into security. It may only lengthen the sequence during which fragility is successfully managed. From the perspective of human origins, this helps explain why persistence alone did not create large human populations early on. The first humans did not emerge into a world where time and adaptation would naturally build toward large-scale stability. They emerged into fluctuating environments, moved through fragmented landscapes, and existed in groups whose internal continuity was always limited by size. Under these conditions, the ability to remain present was meaningful, but it did not guarantee broader growth. A group might maintain itself in one area for an extended period and still contribute only modestly to the total human population, because its continuity remained local, its numbers remained modest, and its resilience remained bounded by the same pressures that had shaped it from the beginning. Archaeological patterns are consistent with this distinction between persistence and security. Some regions show repeated occupation over long intervals, suggesting that human groups were able to maintain a presence there. Yet this does not always coincide with evidence for dense, expanding populations. The same places may show continuity without large-scale accumulation, indicating that they functioned as areas of survival rather than centers of sustained growth. This is an important difference. It suggests that humans often found ways to remain in place, but not necessarily ways to transform that presence into large and durable expansion. The persistence visible in the record is therefore not evidence that limits had been overcome. It may instead be evidence that those limits were being managed, repeatedly, without being removed. When this is brought back to the question of why so few humans were left alive, the answer becomes more precise. Early human populations may have survived often enough to avoid disappearance, but not securely enough to grow far beyond a constrained range. Survival kept the human line present, but the lack of security kept that line thin. Over long stretches of time, this meant that many groups could continue without forming the kind of broad, buffered population structure that would have allowed human numbers to increase steadily and reliably. The result is a history in which endurance is real, but scale remains limited. Humans were not absent, but they were often few, because what existed was a pattern of persistence without strong protection against interruption. In that sense, survival did not fail. It succeeded within narrow bounds, and those bounds help explain why the number of humans remained low across so much of the early human story. There is another reason survival did not become expansion, and it lies in the difference between maintaining a human presence and creating a human surplus. A group can remain alive when the environment offers just enough to support continuity, yet still never reach the point where its numbers begin to grow in a durable way. Surplus is not simply extra food or extra time. It is a condition in which the demands of immediate survival no longer consume nearly all available effort, allowing the group to absorb setbacks, support more individuals across generations, and extend its presence beyond a narrow range. In much of early human history, this condition seems to have been rare, uneven, and often temporary. What existed more often was a form of balance that allowed persistence, but only at a low level. The group could continue, but only by remaining closely tied to the limits of its local environment. This means that even successful survival may have reproduced the same constraint over and over again. A group survived because it fit its place, but that fit did not automatically create the room for larger and more stable growth. This distinction becomes clearer when we think about the long relationship between humans and their environments near the beginning of our species. Early humans did not usually live in systems that produced strong and lasting excess. They moved through landscapes where resources were seasonal, patchy, and often uncertain. Even in places that could support repeated occupation, that support may have been enough only for a small number of people at a time. Under such conditions, continuity depended on staying within a limited scale. If a group became too large for what a region could reliably provide, it would face new pressure to divide, move, or reduce again. In this way, the environment could permit survival while quietly preventing accumulation. Human presence remained real, but it stayed distributed in thin layers across space rather than gathering into dense and secure populations. From the perspective of human origins, this matters because it suggests that the early human condition was not simply one of hardship followed by gradual improvement. It was often a repeated return to narrow balance. Groups adapted to local conditions well enough to remain, yet the same local conditions also placed a ceiling on how much those groups could expand. If one place supported only a modest number of individuals, and neighbouring places were equally limited or unstable, then the total human population would remain low, even when survival was broadly successful. This creates a quieter picture of the past. Humans did not need to be in constant collapse in order to remain few. They only needed to live in worlds where success rarely produced lasting surplus. Archaeological patterns are consistent with this view. Long-term occupation in some regions does not always correspond to signs of dense and steadily expanding populations. Instead, it often suggests repeated use of places that remain viable over time but within limits. These places may have acted as areas of continuity rather than engines of growth. Their importance was not that they allowed humans to become many, but that they allowed some humans to remain. The difference is subtle, yet central to the question. If early human history was shaped by many such places, then the overall population could persist for very long periods without ever becoming large in a secure or cumulative way. When this is brought back to the question of why so few humans were left alive, the answer becomes less dramatic and more structural. Humans may have survived often enough, and in enough places, to avoid disappearance. But the conditions of that survival rarely generated the kind of surplus that turns persistence into expansion. Each group maintained itself close to the threshold of what its world allowed, and that threshold was often low. Over many generations this created a species that endured, but in modest numbers, spread across scattered regions, each one supporting continuity without greatly increasing scale. Early human history, seen in this light, is not only a story of survival under pressure, it is also a story of limits that remained in place even when survival succeeded, keeping human populations present, but small, across long spans of time. What remained of early human populations was not necessarily what was best in any absolute sense. Survival did not operate like a careful selection of ideal forms, preserving the strongest, the wisest, or the most complete version of what a human group could be. It worked through conditions that were local, shifting, and often narrow. A group survived if its traits, habits, timing, and environment aligned well enough for continuity to hold. This alignment might last for a time, then disappear when the environment changed or when the structure of the group became less stable. What continued into the future was therefore not a perfected form of humanity, but a set of lines that remained connected across changing conditions. This distinction matters, because it changes how we understand what it means for only a few humans to remain. It does not mean that those who remained represented the full strength or full possibility of the species. It means only that their continuity was not broken. In early human history, many groups may have been well suited to their immediate surroundings and yet still failed to continue into later generations. Their disappearance would not prove weakness in a simple sense. A group could be highly adapted to one environment and still become vulnerable when that environment shifted, when movement became necessary, or when contact with other groups remained too limited to support recovery. Another group, living under different conditions, might continue not because it was superior in all respects, but because its local conditions remained favorable just long enough, or because its way of life happened to fit the changes better for a certain period. This means that survival was often contingent rather than absolute. It depended on circumstance as much as on adaptation. From the perspective of human origins, this is an important correction. It is easy to imagine the early history of our species as a process in which each stage preserves only the best possible outcomes. But the broader evidence suggests something quieter and less orderly. Early humans lived in fragmented populations under unstable environmental conditions, with limited buffers against change. In such a system, what remained was shaped by chance, geography, timing, and local resilience, as much as by any broad evolutionary advantage. The groups that continued were not selected from a wide and secure population under ideal conditions. They emerged from a landscape where many possible lines of continuity existed for a time, and only some extended far enough to become part of the future. Archaeological and genetic perspectives are both consistent with this view. The scattered nature of the archaeological record suggests that many human groups occupied places for a time and then vanished from those regions. Genetic patterns suggest that only a relatively limited portion of early human diversity continued into later populations. Together, these forms of evidence point toward a history in which continuity was uneven and selective, but not in the simple sense of preserving only what was universally strongest. Instead, continuity reflects what managed to remain aligned with changing conditions across enough generations to endure. This helps explain why early human history can look both resilient and fragile at once. Humans persisted, but the lines that persisted were filtered through a world that did not preserve all forms equally. When we return to the central question, this changes the emotional weight of the answer. Why were so few humans left alive? Not because the world clearly chose its favourites, and not because the future belonged automatically to the most capable. Often, it was because only a few lines remained connected as conditions changed around them. What survived was what could continue, not necessarily what represented the fullest human possibility at the time. Early human history, seen in this way, is not a clean ascent driven by superiority. It is a narrowing passage through unstable conditions, where survival depended on local fit, repeated continuity, and circumstances that did not favour all groups equally. The humans who remained were not the final winners in a simple contest. They were the carriers of lines that, for reasons often ordinary and contingent, did not break. That is why the number left alive could remain so small for so long, and why the future of the species could pass through such a narrow opening without ever proving that narrowness meant perfection. What continues into the future is often shaped by timing as much as by form. A group may possess traits that are well suited to a certain environment, yet if the conditions shift at the wrong moment, those same traits may no longer support continuity. Another group with different traits may encounter a period where the environment aligns with its way of living just long enough for its line to extend further. This difference does not always reflect a lasting advantage. It reflects a temporary alignment between what a group is and what the world happens to offer at that time. In early human history, where environments were changing and populations were small, this role of timing becomes more visible. Continuity depended not only on how well a group could live in its present conditions, but also on whether those conditions remained stable across the generations needed to carry that group forward. This introduces a subtle form of uncertainty into the structure of survival. A group could be well adapted, stable for a time, and still not become part of the longer human story if the sequence of conditions required for its continuation did not hold. Another group, perhaps less broadly adapted, might persist because it passed through a sequence of conditions that, by chance or by local stability, allowed continuity to remain unbroken. This does not reduce the importance of adaptation. It shows that adaptation operates within a moving framework, where its effectiveness depends on how long the environment stays within a range that supports it. When that range shifts, adaptation must change as well, and the ability to change is not evenly distributed across all groups or across all moments. From the perspective of human origins, this helps explain why continuity appears uneven when viewed across time. The emergence of our species did not create a uniform field of equally successful populations. It created many local expressions of human life, each shaped by its own conditions, each following its own path through time. Some of these paths extended further, not because they represented a universal advantage, but because they remained aligned with conditions that allowed them to continue. Others ended, not necessarily because they were less capable in all respects, but because the alignment they depended on did not persist. This produces a pattern where the human story is not a single continuous line, but a collection of lines of varying length, some short, some extended, all shaped by the interplay between adaptation and timing. Archaeological patterns support this view through the uneven duration of occupation across different regions. Some areas show long sequences of human presence, suggesting that conditions remained favorable across multiple generations. Other areas show shorter sequences, where occupation appears and then ends. These differences do not always correspond to clear differences in human capability. They often reflect differences in how long certain environments remained stable or how frequently they shifted. This reinforces the idea that continuity was influenced not only by what humans could do, but by how long their conditions allowed those actions to remain effective. When this perspective is applied to the question of why so few humans were left alive, the answer becomes more nuanced. The number of humans was not determined solely by the presence of advantageous traits or successful adaptations. It was also shaped by the timing of environmental change, by how long favorable conditions lasted, and by whether those conditions aligned with the needs of specific groups across multiple generations. If alignment was brief or uneven, continuity could be interrupted even for groups that were otherwise well suited to their surroundings. This means that the small number of humans who remained was not simply the result of selecting the strongest or the most capable. It was the result of a process in which timing and alignment played a central role, allowing some lines to continue while others, equally real and once equally present, did not extend into the future. In this way, early human history can be understood as a sequence of moments where continuity depended on more than inherent qualities. It depended on how those qualities met the world at specific times, and whether that meeting could be sustained long enough to carry a group forward. The narrowness of the human population at certain periods reflects this delicate interplay, where survival required not only adaptation, but also the persistence of conditions that made that adaptation viable across the fragile chain of generations. If we follow this pattern further, a quieter realization begins to take shape. What remains of humanity at any point in time is not a complete reflection of what once existed. It is a reduced version, shaped by what has continued and what has not. The early human world may have held more variation, more ways of living, and more local expressions of what it meant to be human than what is visible now through traces or inheritance. Many of these expressions likely existed for a time, sustained by their own conditions, their own alignments, and their own internal balance. Yet their continuity did not extend far enough to become part of the longer sequence that leads forward. This does not mean they were incomplete or unsuccessful in their own moment. It means that the conditions required for their continuation did not persist across the span needed to carry them into later generations. In this sense, the early human story includes not only what survived, but also what was gradually left behind. This gradual leaving behind does not occur as a single event. It unfolds over long periods, as different lines of continuity reach their limits under changing conditions. A group may persist for generations, adapting to its environment, maintaining its way of life, and contributing to the local human presence. Then, as conditions shift, that continuity may narrow and eventually end without leaving a direct extension into the future. Another group elsewhere continues, carrying forward a different set of traits, practices, and experiences. Over time, the broader human population becomes composed of those lines that have remained connected, while other lines, once equally real, no longer contribute to the ongoing sequence. This creates a history where the present is not a full accumulation of all past human life, but a filtered result of many separate continuities, each shaped by its own circumstances. From the perspective of human origins, this filtering is not an occasional feature. It is a constant process. Early humans lived in conditions that did not support the preservation of all possible lines of continuity. Environmental variability, small group size, limited connectivity, and biological constraints all contributed to a system where continuation was possible but not guaranteed for every group. The emergence of our species did not eliminate these constraints. It placed humans within them, where survival and continuation depended on repeated alignment with changing conditions. As a result, the early human population was always subject to a form of narrowing, where some lines continued while others ended, without a clear boundary between success and loss. Archaeological and genetic perspectives together support this view. The discontinuous nature of archaeological sites suggests that many groups occupied spaces for a time and then left no further trace. Genetic patterns suggest that only a portion of early human variation persists into later populations. These forms of evidence do not capture every detail, but they align in showing that the history of human continuity is selective, shaped by processes that filter which lines remain connected across time. The absence of certain lines is not always visible directly, but it is implied by the reduced variation and the fragmented record that remains. When we return to the central question, this understanding deepens its meaning. Why were so few humans left alive? Because the path from past to present was not wide enough to carry all that once existed. It was shaped by repeated narrowing, where continuity depended on conditions that were often limited, uneven, and changing. Many human lives, many groups, and many ways of being human existed within this early world, but only some were carried forward across the long sequence of generations. The small number that remained was not the result of a single moment of loss, but the outcome of a long process in which presence was broader than continuity, and continuity was broader than what ultimately endured. Early human history, in this sense, is not only a story of survival, it is a story of quiet reduction, where what remains is meaningful not because it represents everything that was, but because it is what could continue. When all of these layers are placed together, the early human story begins to feel less like a steady unfolding and more like a delicate continuity carried through changing conditions. Human presence did not expand across the world in a single, uninterrupted movement. It appeared in different places, adjusted to local environments, and persisted where conditions allowed, often within narrow limits. What remains visible across time is not the full range of what once existed, but the result of many separate continuities that managed to extend further than others. These continuities were shaped by environment, by the structure of small groups, by the limits of the body, by movement and isolation, and by the subtle processes that determined which lines would remain connected across generations. When viewed together, these factors do not point to a single cause. They form a system in which the number of humans remained constrained because each part of that system limited how far continuity could extend. In such a system, the idea of few humans is not an anomaly that requires a dramatic explanation. It is the natural outcome of conditions that did not support large, stable, and connected populations for long periods of time. The world in which early humans lived did not provide a consistent framework for expansion. It provided a shifting set of possibilities, where survival could be achieved, but where growth was repeatedly moderated by changing conditions. Each group carried forward a part of the human story, but that story did not accumulate in a simple way. It moved through narrow passages, where continuity depended on alignment with conditions that were rarely stable and never uniform across all regions. From the perspective of human origins, this helps reframe what it means to exist as a species over long periods. The early human population was not building steadily toward the present in a straight line. It was maintaining its presence within a system that constantly reshaped the limits of that presence. At times, conditions may have allowed for broader distribution or slightly increased numbers. At other times, those same conditions shifted, reducing the capacity for continuity and returning populations to smaller scales. This fluctuation does not produce a clear upward trajectory. It produces a pattern of persistence within bounds, where the total number of humans reflects the balance between what can be sustained and what cannot. Archaeological and genetic evidence, when considered together, support this interpretation by showing both the fragmentation of presence and the narrowing of continuity. The scattered distribution of sites, the gaps between them, and the patterns of inherited variation all suggest that human populations were often small, separated, and subject to repeated phases of reduction and re-establishment. These patterns do not require a single defining event to explain why numbers remained low. They indicate that the conditions themselves, operating across many regions and many generations, were sufficient to keep populations within a constrained range. When we return to the central question one last time, the answer becomes less about a moment and more about a structure. Why were so few humans left alive? Because the early human world was not built to support many at once, or to keep them connected, or to allow their numbers to grow without interruption. It was built, in a sense, to test continuity again and again, under conditions that did not remain stable long enough for expansion to become secure. The humans who remained did so not because the world opened widely for them, but because they passed through these conditions without their continuity breaking. This understanding carries a quiet implication into the present. What exists now is the result of many such passages, many moments where continuity was maintained within limits that could easily have led to reduction instead. The number of humans today may feel distant from that earlier condition, but it is connected to it through a long sequence of fragile continuities. If we consider that sequence without trying to resolve it into a single cause, it leaves us with a different kind of question, one that does not close the story but keeps it open. If human existence has always depended on such narrow and shifting conditions, how much of what we are now still rests on the same kind of fragile continuity that once kept our numbers so few? If we stay with this thought a little longer, the meaning of human continuity begins to change. It is no longer only a question of how humans survived, but of what survival actually preserved. Across the long early history of our species, continuity did not carry everything forward equally. It carried enough. Enough bodies, enough memory, enough adaptation, enough connection between generations to keep the human line from ending. But enough is a narrow word. It does not imply abundance. It does not imply safety. It suggests a minimum that was reached again and again, under conditions where failure remained possible. This is why the early human story can feel both durable and precarious at the same time. Humans endured, yet the form of that endurance was often thin, local, and exposed to interruption. A species can continue for a very long time in this state, preserving its existence without ever escaping the pressures that keep that existence fragile. That distinction matters, because it prevents us from turning survival into a comforting illusion. The fact that humans remained does not mean the system that carried them was broad or secure. It means only that it did not break completely. When viewed through the beginning of our species, continuity looks less like a strong road stretching forward and more like a series of crossings, each one narrow, each one dependent on conditions holding together for long enough. A group survived a phase of environmental change. A sequence of generations remained intact in one region. A line of ancestry continued while others ended. A pattern of movement happened to lead toward a place that could still be lived in. None of these crossings alone explains the whole human story. Yet taken together, they show how little was required for reduction to remain close, and how much depended on continuity being maintained in many separate places at once. This is also why early human history should not be imagined as a clean story of constant loss followed by final success. It was more uneven than that. Some regions may have held continuity for longer periods. Some groups may have found relative stability for a time. Some lines of ancestry may have widened briefly before narrowing again. But these local successes did not remove the larger constraints. They existed within them. The archaeological record remains broken into scattered traces, and the inherited record still suggests that only a limited portion of early diversity was carried forward. These are not signs of a species moving through a wide and secure channel. They are signs of continuity being repeatedly achieved without ever becoming fully insulated from disappearance. When we bring all of this back to the title question, the answer becomes quieter, but also more complete. So few humans were left alive not necessarily because one single event nearly erased them, but because the deeper structure of early human existence rarely allowed many to remain for long in a secure way. Populations were small, separated, dependent on unstable environments, biologically limited, and carried through time by generational chains that could thin without warning. What remained was what those conditions allowed to continue. That is a different kind of explanation from the dramatic image of one final collapse. It suggests instead that smallness itself may have been the ordinary condition of human existence through much of the deep past. And if that is true, then the present acquires a different kind of weight. The great scale of humanity now can make early fragility feel remote, almost irrelevant, yet everything current still rests on those earlier passages through narrow conditions, on those lines that did not break, on those groups that remained connected just long enough. The story becomes less about triumph over the past and more about inheritance from a past that was repeatedly close to reduction. Seen in this way, the survival of humans is real, but it is not simple. It is the survival of something that remained alive through repeated narrowing, through losses that were often quiet, and through continuities that were rarely guaranteed. If we listen carefully to that older pattern, it leaves behind one final thought that does not fully settle. Perhaps the deepest truth is not that humanity became many, but that it remained possible at all. If we let the whole question settle without forcing it into a single dramatic answer, a quieter image begins to remain. The early human story was not carried forward by certainty. It was carried forward by continuation under pressure, by the repeated survival of small groups whose presence could easily have narrowed further or disappeared entirely from particular places. The world did not guarantee that humans would become widespread, numerous, or secure. For long stretches of time, it only allowed a few scattered lines to remain connected across generations. What endured was not the full range of what once existed, but the part that could keep passing through changing landscapes, unstable climates, biological limits, and the silence between distant groups. This means the question was never only about one moment when humans were reduced. It was about a long condition in which reduction stayed close, and continuity had to be remade again and again. Seen from the beginning of our species, being few may have been far more normal than being many. That is why the answer does not rest in a single disaster, a single region, or a single population event. It rests in the combined structure of early human life, where environments shifted, groups remained small, connections were weak, surplus was limited, and the chain of generations could thin without warning. Under such conditions, the continuation of humanity was never broad enough to carry everything forward. It carried only what remained linked long enough to persist. This does not make early humans weak in any simple sense. It makes their existence precise, conditional, and exposed to the kinds of limits that modern scale can easily hide from view. The human line survived, but it survived within boundaries that often kept it close to disappearance in one place or another. What we inherit now is the result of that narrow continuity, not the proof that it was ever easy or secure. There is also a deeper lesson in this. When we imagine the past, it is tempting to search for a clean turning point, some single explanation that can contain the uncertainty. Yet the older record resists that kind of certainty. Archaeology shows fragments, not full continuity. Genetics shows narrowing, not complete recovery of all that once existed. Environmental evidence shows repeated change, not stable support. Taken together, these do not give us a dramatic final answer. They give us something more honest. They suggest that humanity remained alive not because the path was wide, but because enough lines endured within a world that rarely made endurance simple. In that sense, the human story is not only about survival, it is also about loss that remained close to survival at every stage, about how much vanished quietly while some continuity continued elsewhere. Many human lives, many groups, and many local ways of being human likely appeared and ended without becoming part of the longer chain that leads to the present. What remains is meaningful, but it is also partial. It is the reduced result of a much broader field of past existence. That recognition changes the emotional tone of the question, why were so few humans left alive? Because early human history was structured in a way that rarely allowed many to remain together securely and for long. And why does that matter now? And because it reminds us that being here is not the outcome of a smooth ascent, but of repeated continuities that might easily have narrowed further. The value in that realization is not fear, it is perspective. It invites a slower kind of humility, one that sees humanity not as something that was always destined to fill the world, but as something that persisted through conditions that often allowed only the smallest margin. Perhaps that is the most useful truth such a history can leave behind, that much of what we call human history was not the story of abundance, but the story of enough, and that enough, carried carefully across time, became everything that still remains.